I was lying on the floor of my brother's wedding reception, my scalp burning, my hair tangled in my mother's fist, while 150 guests stared in frozen silence. "You're an embarrassment to this family," she screamed, her face twisted with rage as she yanked me down like I was nothing. I should have been shocked, but the truth, I'd been invisible my entire life, the daughter who was never good enough, never celebrated, never loved. My golden child brother got everything. I got the leftovers of a mother's broken heart. What my mother didn't know as she stood over me playing the victim to concerned guests was that 5 cameras had captured every second, every calculated word, every deliberate movement, every cruel smile when she thought no one was watching. Within 48 hours, that footage went viral. 2 million views, and one of those viewers was her boss. She lost everything. Her 6-figure job, her reputation, her carefully constructed mask of respectability shattered. But that was just the beginning. Because when she came after me with lies, manipulation, and a campaign to destroy what was left of my life, I made a decision. I stopped being invisible. I stopped apologizing for existing, and I fought back. What happened next exposed secrets buried for 35 years, courtroom battles that changed everything, and a truth so devastating it would break my heart before it finally set me free. This is the story of how I went from victim to survivor, and how I learned that sometimes the only way to find peace is to burn down everything that's suffocating you. Stick with me. You won't believe where this goes. My name is Amanda Lopez. I'm 35 years old, and for the last decade I've built a quiet but successful career as an interior designer in Portland, Oregon. Most people don't know that about me. My family certainly doesn't. To them, I'm just the disappointing daughter who never quite measured up, the one who faded into the background, while my younger brother, the golden child, collected all the applause. I learned a long time ago that being invisible was safer than being seen. But on the day of my brother's wedding, that invisible shield shattered in the most public, humiliating way possible. I arrived at the venue early, hoping to blend into the pre-ceremony chaos. The moment I walked through those doors, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the old instinct to make myself smaller. My brother stood at the centre of a crowd of relatives glowing in his tailored tuxedo while everyone fawned over him like he'd just discovered the cure for cancer. He'd landed a decent sales job and was marrying a woman from a well-connected family. To hear my mother tell it, he was royalty. When I approached to offer my congratulations, he gave me a distracted half hug and immediately turned back to his audience. I smiled and stepped away. That's what I always did. During cocktail hour, my mother held court near the bar, surrounded by aunts and cousins. I nursed a glass of sparkling water in the corner, waiting for the ceremony to begin, so I could slip into a back row and disappear. But my mother's voice carried across the room like a blade. "Well, at least one of my children is settling down," she announced loudly, her eyes finding mine across the crowd. "Some of us are still waiting for Amanda to figure out what she's doing with her life." Laughter rippled through the group. My face burned, but I said nothing. Then she added, her voice dripping with false concern. 35 and still single. I keep telling her she's too picky, but what can you do? More laughter. I gripped my glass tighter and looked away. I thought that would be the worst of it. I was wrong. After the ceremony, as guests mingled during the reception, I made the mistake of approaching my brother and his new wife to offer a proper congratulation. I'd chosen my dress carefully, a simple, elegant navy blue midi dress, with modest sleeves and a conservative neckline. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. But before I could even speak, my mother intercepted me, her face already flushed with champagne and barely concealed contempt. "What are you wearing?" she hissed, her voice low at first. I looked down at my dress, confused. "Mum, it's just..." She cut me off. "Just, you show up to your brother's wedding dressed like you're going to a funeral. Are you trying to embarrass this family?" Her voice was rising now. Guests nearby turned to look. I felt my throat tighten, my hands trembling. "Mum, please, it's fine. Let's not..." But she wasn't listening. She never listened. "You're an embarrassment," she screamed, and before I could react, her hand shot out and grabbed a fistful of my hair. The pain was instant and shocking. She yanked me downward with a force that sent me stumbling, and then I was on the floor, my knees hitting the polished wood, my scalp screaming in agony. The room went silent. 150 people stood frozen, their champagne glasses suspended mid-air, their conversations dying in their throats. I looked up through the blur of tears and saw my mother standing over me, breathing hard, her face twisted in something between rage and satisfaction. And then, just as quickly, her expression shifted. She turned to the crowd, her hand fluttering to her chest, her voice suddenly weak and shaky. "I'm so sorry, everyone. Amanda and I, we've had a difficult relationship. I'm sorry." She made it sound like I was the problem, like I'd provoked her, like this was somehow my fault. I scrambled to my feet, my face burning with humiliation, and I walked out of that reception hall without looking back. I didn't see the 5 videographers and wedding guests who had captured every second of what just happened. I didn't know those cameras had caught not just the attack, but my mother's cold, calculated smile. The moment she thought no one was watching anymore. She had no idea the cameras were rolling and that one moment would destroy the life she had carefully built. I spent the next 2 days in my apartment with the curtains drawn, replaying the humiliation over and over in my mind. The feel of her fingers twisted in my hair, the hard crack of my knees against the floor, the awful silence of 150 people watching me crumble. I'd called in sick to work on Monday, something I never did, and spent most of the weekend alternating between numb silence and crying jags that left me exhausted. My phone sat on the coffee table screen down because I couldn't bear to see the family group chat that I knew would be filled with messages about how I'd ruined my brother's special day. By Sunday evening, I'd convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, people would forget. Weddings were full of drama. This would blow over. I'd go back to being invisible and life would return to its predictable, painful normal. I was so incredibly wrong. Monday morning, my phone started buzzing, and then it didn't stop. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was my mother or relatives calling to berate me further. But the buzzing became relentless, a constant vibration that seemed to shake the entire apartment. Finally, around 10 in the morning, I picked it up. 47 missed calls, 132 text messages. My social media notifications had climbed into the thousands. My hands started shaking as I opened the first message from my college roommate Sarah, whom I hadn't spoken to in 3 years. "Oh my God, Amanda, I just saw the video. Are you okay?" "Video? What video?" My stomach dropped as I scrolled through more messages. Former co-workers, high school acquaintances I barely remembered, distant cousins, even my dentist's receptionist had messaged me on Facebook. They all mentioned the same thing: the video. I clicked on the link Sarah had sent and my worst nightmare materialised on my screen. There I was, in my navy blue dress, my mother's hand twisted in my hair, yanking me to the ground like I was a disobedient child. The video was crystal clear, shot from a perfect angle that captured every detail. My mother's contorted face, my shock and pain, the moment I hit the floor. And worst of all, the caption someone had written: "Mother of the groom attacks her own daughter at wedding. This is abuse." The view count sat at 2.3 million. I felt like I couldn't breathe. My private humiliation, the worst moment of my life, had been uploaded for the entire world to consume like entertainment. I watched the video 3 times, unable to look away, seeing myself through strangers' eyes. The comment section was a war zone. Thousands of people weighing in on my life, my family, my pain. Some were sympathetic. That poor woman, you can see the years of abuse in her eyes. Others were cruel. She must have done something to deserve it. and still others treated it like a spectator sport. Family drama at weddings hits different. I felt violated in a way I couldn't articulate, exposed and raw and utterly powerless. My phone rang again. This time it was a number I didn't recognise with a local area code. Against my better judgment, I answered. Ms. Lopez, this is Jennifer Chen from KPTV News. We'd love to have you on our evening segment to discuss the incident at your brother's wedding. We think your story could help other abuse survivors find their voice. I hung up without responding, my heart hammering. The local news, they were calling me. How did they even get my number? Within the hour, I'd received 5 more calls from different news outlets, 2 from podcasters who covered family dynamics, and 1 from a producer at a national morning show. I turned off my phone and threw it across the room. But the silence that followed was somehow worse. I sat in my darkened living room, hugging my knees to my chest, and tried to understand how my life had become a viral spectacle in less than 48 hours. I hadn't asked for this. I hadn't wanted this attention. All I'd ever wanted was to be left alone to build my quiet life away from my family's toxicity to finally have some peace. Instead, millions of strangers had watched the worst moment of my life, dissected it, judged it, shared it with their friends. I felt like I was being assaulted all over again, except this time the audience was global. Then my mother started calling. The first voicemail came Monday afternoon. Her voice was thin and trembling, the voice she used when she wanted sympathy. Amanda, sweetheart, please call me back. I am so sorry about what happened at the wedding. I was under so much stress with all the planning and I had too much champagne and I wasn't myself. Please, let's talk about this privately. We don't need the whole world involved in our family business. I deleted it. The second voicemail came an hour later and the tone had shifted. Amanda, you need to call me back right now. Do you have any idea what you've done? People are calling me, harassing me, saying terrible things. You posted that video, didn't you? How could you do this to your own mother? I hadn't posted anything but facts, had never mattered much to her. The third voicemail was pure venom. You've always been jealous of your brother. You couldn't stand that he was happy that he found someone who actually loves him. So you had to make his wedding about you, didn't you? Showing up in that awful dress, making a scene, and now spreading lies on the internet. You're pathetic, Amanda. You've always been pathetic. Her words landed like punches, each one finding the bruises she'd spent 35 years creating. I saved that voicemail, though I couldn't have told you why. Maybe because it was proof. Proof that I wasn't crazy. Proof that this had always been who she was. By Tuesday morning, the video had passed 4 million views. My brother sent me one text. Thanks for ruining my wedding. Mom's a mess. Hope you're happy. I stared at those words for a long time, waiting to feel something. Guilt, maybe. Shame. But all I felt was a strange, hollow numbness. He hadn't asked if I was okay. He hadn't acknowledged what she had done to me. In his mind, I was still the problem. I was always the problem. I didn't know it then, but while I was hiding in my apartment, drowning in messages and voicemails and the weight of unwanted viral fame, someone else was watching that video. Someone who knew my mother. Someone who saw past her carefully constructed image of the devoted single mother, the respected professional, the pillar of the community. I didn't learn about what happened to my mother until nearly 3 weeks after the wedding, and even then I heard it from a stranger. By that point, I'd finally returned to work, moving through my days like a ghost designing spaces for clients, while barely inhabiting my own life. The viral video had started to fade from the top of people's feeds, replaced by the next scandal, the next tragedy, the next piece of content to consume and forget. I'd stopped checking my phone obsessively. I'd stopped reading the comments. I was trying in my own fumbling way to piece together some semblance of normalcy. But normal, I was learning, was just another word for denial. I was at a coffee shop near my office when a woman approached my table. She was maybe 40, dressed in business casual with kind eyes and a hesitant smile. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Are you Amanda Lopez?" My stomach clenched. I'd gotten used to being recognised in public, now that awful moment when someone's eyes would widen with recognition, and I'd brace myself for either sympathy or judgment. "Yes," I said carefully. She sat down without asking, and something in her urgency made me let her. "I work at Cascade Regional Healthcare," she said. "Your mother was my boss." "Was. Past tense." She paused, watching my face. "You don't know, do you?" The coffee shop noise faded into background static as she told me what had happened. My mother had been the HR director at Cascade Regional Healthcare for almost 12 years, a position she wore, like armour, a title she dropped into every conversation to prove her worth. It was a prestigious job at one of the largest healthcare corporations in the Pacific Northwest, overseeing employee conduct, workplace safety, and conflict resolution for over 3,000 employees. She made $95,000 a year plus benefits, and she never let me forget that she'd achieved this through hard work and sacrifice, unlike her disappointing daughter who played with fabric swatches. The irony of her being responsible for workplace ethics while terrorizing her own daughter wasn't lost on me, but I'd learned long ago that hypocrisy and self-awareness rarely occupied the same space. According to this woman, whose name was Michelle, the video had reached Cascade Regional within days of going viral. At first, it was just whispers in break rooms, forwarded links in private messages, the uncomfortable recognition that their HR director was the woman yanking her daughter to the ground at a wedding. But then the emails started. Dozens of them sent to the CEO, the board of directors, the compliance department. Current employees wrote expressing profound discomfort with having someone who displayed public violence in charge of mediating workplace conflicts. How could they trust her to handle harassment complaints fairly? How could they feel safe reporting issues to someone who clearly had no control over her own aggressive behaviour? Community members who'd seen the video wrote in questioning the company's values and commitment to non-violence. Michelle leaned forward, her voice dropping. "But here's the thing that really got her fired," she said. "The investigation turned up complaints that had been buried. Your mother had a pattern. 3 formal complaints in the last 5 years about her own behaviour, intimidating employees during disciplinary meetings, making inappropriate comments, creating hostile environments. She'd used her position to make those complaints disappear, but once the CEO started digging, once they saw that video and realised it wasn't an isolated incident, they couldn't ignore it anymore." The company launched an internal investigation 2 days after the video went viral. For 2 weeks, they interviewed employees, reviewed security footage from the office, examined her personnel file with fresh eyes. My mother, I learned, had come to work every day during those 2 weeks, acting as if nothing was wrong, as if the whole world hadn't just watched her attack her own daughter. She told colleagues that the video was taken out of context, that I was a troubled person with a history of causing drama, that she was the real victim of a vindictive daughter's smear campaign. Some people believed her. My mother had always been persuasive when she needed to be. But the CEO watched the full wedding video, not just the assault, but the aftermath, the way she'd immediately shifted into victim mode for the guests, the calculated performance of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. And when they factored in the buried complaints, the pattern of behaviour, the sheer liability of keeping someone like her in a position of power, the decision became inevitable. 3 days ago, my mother had been called into a meeting and terminated immediately for violating the company's morality clause and bringing disrepute to the organisation. At 58 years old, with a termination on her record and a viral video attached to her name, her prospects for finding another position at that level were virtually non-existent. Michelle stood to leave, touching my shoulder gently. "I'm sorry you went through what you did," she said, "but I'm not sorry she's gone. A lot of us had been afraid of her for years. That video just gave the company permission to do what they should have done a long time ago." After she left, I sat in that coffee shop for 2 more hours, my coffee growing cold, trying to process what I'd just learned. My mother had lost everything: her job, her income, her reputation. The carefully constructed image of the professional, respectable single mother who'd sacrificed everything for her children had crumbled in less than 3 weeks. I waited for the satisfaction to come, the vindication, the sense that justice had finally been served. But all I felt was a strange, hollow emptiness. That evening I finally looked up the story online. The local business journal had reported on it. Cascade Regional Healthcare parts ways, with HR director following viral video controversy. The article was clinical professional mentioning the video only briefly before discussing the company's commitment to ethical leadership and workplace safety. They'd included a statement from the CEO about holding all employees, especially those in positions of authority, to the highest standards of conduct. My mother's name appeared 3 times. Mine appeared once as her adult daughter. I read the article twice, then closed my laptop and stared at the wall. My phone rang at exactly 7:30 that evening. My mother's number. I let it go to voicemail, but this time I listened immediately. Her voice was different now, stripped of the thin veneer of maternal concern or performative weakness. It was pure rage, raw and jagged, and utterly focused. "You destroyed me," she hissed into the phone. "You posted that video. You called my company. You turned everyone against me. I gave you life, Amanda. I raised you alone after your father died, and this is how you repay me, by taking everything I worked for. You're a vindictive, ungrateful, worthless excuse for a daughter, and I will never forgive you for this. Never." She showed up at my apartment the next evening without warning, pounding on my door with such force that I thought something terrible had happened. For a split second, some deeply conditioned part of me worried that she was hurt, that she needed help, that despite everything, she was still my mother, and I was still her daughter, and that meant something. I opened the door, and the woman standing in my hallway looked like a stranger wearing my mother's face. Her hair, usually meticulously styled, hung limp and unwashed. Her clothes were wrinkled. Her eyes were red and swollen, but whether from crying or rage, I couldn't tell. Maybe both. "How could you?" she said, pushing past me into my apartment before I could react. "How could you do this to me?" I closed the door slowly, my heart already racing, that old familiar fear creeping up my spine. "Mum, I don't know what you're talking about." It was a lie. I knew exactly what she was talking about, but some part of me still wanted to avoid the confrontation, to smooth things over, to make myself small enough that her anger would pass over me like a storm. She whirled around and I saw it, then the thing I'd spent 35 years trying not to see, the absolute conviction in her eyes that I was her enemy. "You posted that video," she screamed, her voice cracking. "You had someone record it, and then you posted it online to humiliate me, to destroy everything I worked for." I took a step back, my hands raised in a gesture of peace that felt pathetic, even as I made it. "Mum, I didn't post anything. I didn't even know someone had recorded it until the video was already viral. I had nothing to do with it." But she wasn't listening. She never listened. She paced my small living room like a caged animal, her hands gesturing wildly, her words tumbling over each other in a torrent of accusation and self-pity. "They fired me, Amanda. Do you understand that 12 years I gave to that company? 12 years of my life, and they threw me away like garbage because of you." Her voice broke into a sob, and for a moment she looked genuinely devastated, shoulders shaking, tears streaming down her face. This was the part where I was supposed to comfort her. This was the script we'd followed my entire life. She would hurt me, then cry, and I would apologize for making her hurt me. I opened my mouth to say I was sorry, the words automatic muscle memory, but they wouldn't come. She looked up at me through her tears, and when she saw that I wasn't moving toward her, wasn't offering the comfort, she expected her expression shifted. The grief vanished, replaced by something harder, colder. "I'm going to lose my house," she said flatly. "My mortgage payment is $3,200 a month. My retirement savings are nowhere near enough to cover it. I'm 58 years old, Amanda. Do you know how hard it is to find work at my age? Especially now with that video attached to my name. I'm going to lose everything and it's your fault. I didn't post the video. I repeated, my voice steadier now. And I didn't make you grab my hair and throw me to the ground in front of 150 people. You did that. The words hung in the air between us, dangerous and true. Her face flushed deep red and she took a step toward me. I was stressed. It was your brother's wedding and you showed up looking like you were going to a funeral. And you have this way of making everything about you, this energy that just sucks the joy out of every room. And I just snapped. Anyone would have snapped. I felt something crack open inside my chest. Not pain exactly, but clarity. I'd heard these words before in 1,000 different forms my whole life. Nothing was ever her fault. Every wound she inflicted was somehow my doing, my provocation, my failure. I'd spent decades trying to figure out what I'd done wrong, how I could be better, how I could finally earn the love that should have been freely given. And standing there in my own apartment watching her perform her grief and rage like a weapon, I finally understood there was nothing I could have done. There was no version of me that would have been enough. You planned this, she continued, her voice rising again. You've always been jealous of your brother. You couldn't stand that he was happy, that he found someone, that he has a real career and a future. So you had to ruin his wedding. You had to make it all about poor, pathetic Amanda and her mean mother. And then you made sure everyone would see it. You orchestrated this whole thing to destroy me. The accusations were so absurd, so disconnected from reality, that I almost laughed. Almost. But there was nothing funny about watching my mother rewrite history in real time. Watching her convince herself that I was the villain in a story where I'd only ever been the victim. I gave you life, she shouted, and there it was, the ultimate trump card, the debt I could never repay. I raised you alone after your father died. I worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over your head. I sacrificed everything for you and your brother. And this is how you repay me. By spreading lies, by turning the whole world against me. You're destroying this family, Amanda. You've always wanted to destroy this family. Her finger jabbed toward me with each accusation, and I watched it come closer and closer, watched her work herself into a frenzy, watched the performance she'd perfected over decades of making me responsible for her unhappiness. And then something inside me simply stopped. Stopped bending, stopped breaking, stopped trying to make myself small enough to fit into her narrative. Get out, I said quietly. She froze. Her finger still pointed at me, her mouth open mid-sentence. What? She said. Get out of my apartment. I repeated, and my voice didn't shake. I didn't post that video. I didn't ruin your career. I didn't make you assault me at my brother's wedding. You did that. You made those choices. And I'm done taking responsibility for your actions. Her face went through a series of expressions so quickly I could barely track them. Shock, disbelief, rage, and finally something that looked almost like fear. You can't talk to me like that, she said, but her voice had lost its certainty. I'm your mother. The word mother felt hollow now, a title without meaning, a role she'd never actually fulfilled. You can leave on your own, or I can call the police and have you removed for trespassing, I said, walking to the door and opening it. Your choice. For a long moment, we stared at each other across the small space of my living room. I saw her calculating, trying to figure out which tactic would work, which mask to put on. But I'd finally learned to see through all of them. She grabbed her purse and walked to the door, pausing in the doorway to deliver one last blow. You'll regret this, she said. You'll come crawling back, apologizing, begging for forgiveness, and I won't be there. You'll be alone for the rest of your life, and you'll have no one to blame but yourself. She left her footsteps echoing in the hallway, and I closed the door behind her. I stood there for a long time, my back against the door, my whole body shaking. But it wasn't fear. It wasn't the old familiar anxiety of having displeased her. It was something else entirely, something that felt like power, like possibility, like the first breath after being underwater too long. That night, as I locked my door, I realized something had broken inside me, and what emerged wasn't weakness, but fire. That fire kept me awake all night. I sat on my couch in the darkness, wrapped in a blanket, unable to stop my mind from racing backward through the years. For 35 years, I'd accepted my role in the family as simply the way things were, the natural order of a universe where my brother shone, and I faded into the background. But now, with my mother's words still echoing in my apartment, and that new, fierce clarity burning in my chest, I found myself asking the question I'd never dared to ask before: when did it start? When did I become the daughter who didn't deserve love? The memories came in fragments, sharp and painful. I remembered being 7 years old, watching my mother buy my brother a new winter coat from the department store while handing me a bag of clothes from Goodwill. "You grow so fast, there's no point wasting money on new things for you," she'd said, as if my brother wasn't growing just as quickly. I remembered being 10 and bringing home straight A's, my mother glancing at them for maybe 3 seconds before turning back to the television. 2 weeks later, my brother brought home B's and C's, and she took him out for ice cream to celebrate his hard work. I learned early that my achievements were invisible, expected, not worth acknowledging, while his mere existence was cause for celebration. By the time I was 12, I'd stopped trying to compete for her attention. I made myself useful instead, doing laundry and cooking dinner and watching my brother after school while she worked late. I thought if I could just be helpful enough, quiet enough, undemanding enough, maybe she'd notice me in a good way. But usefulness isn't love, and being parentified as a child doesn't earn you affection. It just teaches you that your value lies in how much you can give while asking for nothing in return. The real darkness came after my father died. I was 15, caught in that awful space between childhood and adulthood, and suddenly the only parent I'd ever felt truly saw me was gone. My father had been quiet, steady, the kind of man who showed love through actions rather than words. He came to my school art shows. He helped me with my math homework. He told me I was smart, capable, destined for good things. When he died of a sudden heart attack, I felt like the ground had opened up beneath me. But I wasn't allowed to grieve. My mother's grief consumed all the oxygen in the house, and my job became managing her pain while suffocating my own. She'd rage at me in those terrible months after his death, her face contorted with an anger that seemed bottomless. "If only you were more like your brother," she'd scream during one of her episodes. "Maybe your father wouldn't have left us. Maybe the stress of having a daughter like you didn't kill him." I was 15 years old, and I believed her. I carried the weight of my father's death like a stone in my chest, convinced that somehow I had contributed to it. My brother, meanwhile, was coddled and protected from her moods. He got to be the grieving son. I got to be the scapegoat. I worked part-time through high school, saving every penny for community college, because there was no college fund for me. My mother had opened a savings account for my brother when he was born, but there was nothing set aside for my education. "You'll figure it out," she said when I asked. "You're resourceful." My brother would attend a state university on her dime, living in a dorm, enjoying the full college experience. I would take classes at night while working full-time, sleeping 4 hours a night, living on ramen and coffee, building my future one exhausting day at a time. But there was one memory that surfaced that night, a memory I'd buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. I was 12 years old, a few months before my father died, and I'd been exploring the attic looking for old books. Tucked in a dusty cardboard box beneath moth-eaten blankets, I found a photograph. It was a baby picture, the kind parents take at the hospital, with the little card that says the baby's name and birth weight. The baby in the photo looked exactly like me. Same dark hair, same nose, same serious expression I'd seen in my own baby pictures. but the name on the card wasn't Amanda. It was Emily. I'd brought the photo downstairs confused. My mother was in the kitchen making dinner, and I held it out to her. "Mum, who's Emily?" I asked innocently. The change in her face was instantaneous and terrifying. All the colour drained away and her eyes went cold and hard. She snatched the photo from my hand so violently that the edge of it cut my finger. "Where did you get this?" she demanded, her voice low and dangerous. "Don't you ever go through my things again." Before I could answer, she'd slapped the photo away, and it fell to the floor face down. She never spoke of it again, and I was too afraid to ask. I'd forgotten about that photo, or maybe I'd trained myself to forget filing it away in that mental drawer where children put the things that don't make sense, the things that scare them. But sitting in my dark apartment at 3 a.m, that memory blazed back to life with perfect clarity. Emily. A baby who looked exactly like me but wasn't me. A photo that made my mother react with such visceral rage that I'd learned never to mention it again. Despite everything, I'd somehow built a life. I put myself through design school, working 3 jobs, sleeping in my car some nights when I couldn't afford both rent and tuition. I discovered I had an eye for colour and space, a gift for understanding what people needed from their environments. I started taking small freelance projects, then bigger ones. By the time I was 30, I had my own small firm with a growing roster of clients. Last year, I'd cleared $180,000 in revenue. My family knew none of this. As far as they were concerned, I was still struggling, still the disappointing daughter who'd never quite launched. I'd learned to keep my success hidden because the one time I tried to share good news, my mother had dismissed it instantly and then asked to borrow $5,000 in the same breath. So I lived, modestly drove an old car, kept my head down, and built my life in the shadows, where her contempt couldn't reach me. But now, sitting in the aftermath of finally standing up to her, I realised how much that silence had cost me. I'd hidden my light to avoid her jealousy. I'd made myself small to avoid her rage. I'd spent 35 years trying to solve the puzzle of why she couldn't love me, convinced that if I could just find the right answer, everything would change. The answer to that question came to me as the sun rose over Portland, casting pale light through my living room windows. Was I brave enough to find out what made my mother cruel? Maybe. But first, I needed to understand something else. Who was I, beneath all the years of making myself small? I'd spent so long hiding, so long pretending to be less than I was, that I'd almost forgotten the truth. So, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened my laptop and looked at my life through clear eyes. Amanda Lopez Design had been operating for 7 years, though my family would have been shocked to learn it existed at all. What started as freelance projects done on weekends while I worked retail had grown into a legitimate business with a small office in the Pearl District, 2 part-time employees, and a client list that would have impressed anyone in the industry. Last year, I'd cleared $180,000 in revenue. This year was tracking even higher. I owned my condo outright, paid off 3 years ago, when a particularly lucrative hotel redesign came through. I had no debt, a healthy retirement account, and enough in savings to weather any storm. My portfolio told a story my mother had never bothered to ask about. There was the Pearl District loft I designed for a tech entrepreneur, all clean lines and natural light featured in Portland Monthly magazine, though my name appeared only in the small print of the credits. There was the boutique hotel in Bend, each room a different interpretation of Pacific Northwest aesthetics, where the owner had given me complete creative freedom, and the results had exceeded everyone's expectations. There were the 3 celebrity homes I'd worked on under strict NDAs projects I could never publicly claim, but that had led to referrals worth their weight in gold. Each image in my portfolio represented not just a space I'd created, but proof that I was good at what I did. Very good. My clients came back to me again and again. They referred their friends. They wrote glowing reviews that I never showed anyone in my family. Amanda has an intuitive understanding of how people want to live in their spaces. One review read, She listens in a way that makes you feel truly heard, then creates environments that feel like home before you've even moved in. Another client had written, "Working with Amanda Lopez was the best decision we made in our entire renovation. She's professional, creative, and has impeccable taste. We couldn't be happier." These words from strangers who'd hired me for my expertise meant more to me than any acknowledgement from my family ever could. But my family didn't know any of this existed. As far as my mother and brother were concerned, I was still struggling, still figuring things out, still the disappointing daughter who'd never quite launched into a real career. I'd trained them to believe this through years of deflection and omission. When they asked what I did for work, I'd mumble something vague about design consulting and change the subject. When they asked how much I made, I'd shrug and say enough to get by. I drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic that ran perfectly well, but looked unremarkable. I dressed simply. I lived in a modest condo in a decent but not flashy neighbourhood. Nothing about my external life suggested success, and that had been entirely intentional. I remembered with painful clarity the last time I tried to be honest about my professional life. It was 8 years ago, and I'd just landed my first major client, a lawyer who wanted his entire downtown condo redesigned. The contract was worth $40,000 more money than I'd ever made on a single project. I was 27 years old and felt like I was finally becoming the person I'd worked so hard to be. I'd called my mother so full of hope and stupid, naive pride. "Mum, I got this amazing client." I'd said, my voice bright with accomplishment. "It's a really big project and it's going to completely change my business." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I'd waited for her to say she was proud that she was happy for me, that she'd always known I had potential. Instead, she'd said, "That's nice, honey," in the same tone she might use to acknowledge that I'd bought groceries. Then, without missing a beat, she'd continued, "Actually, since you're doing so well, I was wondering if you could lend me $5,000. My car needs work and money's tight right now. You know, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important." Just like that, my achievement had been transformed into resource for her extraction. Not pride, not celebration, just an opportunity to take. I'd learned my lesson that day. Success made me a target. Achievement made me useful. The moment my family saw that I had something, they'd find ways to diminish it or take it. So I'd hidden everything. I'd made myself small and struggling and forgettable because it was safer than being seen. But safety, I was beginning to understand, had come at a terrible cost. Now, sitting in my apartment with my laptop open, I scrolled through the messages that had piled up over the last few weeks. My aunt calling me ungrateful. My cousin saying I was tearing the family apart. My brother's wife posting on social media about family members who betray their own blood for attention. Not one of them had asked if I was okay. Not one had acknowledged what my mother had done to me. They were so invested in maintaining the family mythology, in protecting my mother's image, that they couldn't see the truth, even when it was recorded in high definition and viewed by millions. I pulled up my business bank account and stared at the numbers. I'd built this. Every dollar, every client, every success had come from my own work, my own talent, my own refusal to give up, even when I had no support. I'd done it while being told I wasn't good enough, while being dismissed and diminished and treated like I was lucky just to exist. And I'd hidden it all because I'd been conditioned to believe that making myself invisible was the only way to survive. But I was tired of surviving. I was tired of shrinking. I was tired of letting people who'd never supported me define who I was and what I was worth. My mother had lost her job and she blamed me. My family had turned against me and they blamed me. They saw me as ungrateful, vindictive, destructive. But none of them knew the first thing about who I actually was. I opened a new document and started making notes. Facts, evidence, timeline. If my mother wanted to blame me for her consequences, if my family wanted to paint me as the villain, maybe it was time they knew the truth. Not just about the wedding, but about everything. About the years of differential treatment. about the emotional abuse, about the pattern of behaviour that had led to that moment on the reception hall floor. As I stared at my design portfolio that night, I made a decision. Peace was no longer an option. The next morning, I called a law firm that specialised in family law and personal injury. The receptionist transferred me to Catherine Chen, an attorney whose website bio described her as someone who advocates for clients in complex family disputes and abuse cases. When I explained my situation in broad strokes, she asked if I could come in that afternoon. "From what you've described," she said carefully, "you may have several viable claims, but we need to discuss this in detail." Her office was in a downtown high-rise with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Catherine was maybe 50, with sharp eyes and a warm but no-nonsense demeanour that immediately put me at ease. She offered me tea, then sat across from me with a legal pad and listened as I told her everything. The wedding incident, the viral video I hadn't posted, my mother's campaign of blame, the decades of differential treatment and emotional abuse, the confrontation in my apartment. I showed her the video, the voicemails, the text messages from family members calling me vindictive and ungrateful. I showed her the threatening messages my mother had left, the ones where her mask slipped completely. Catherine took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions, her expression growing more serious as the story unfolded. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and studied me for a long moment. "Amanda," she said finally, "based on what you've told me and the evidence you've shown me, you have a strong case for multiple claims: assault and battery for the physical attack at the wedding, defamation, if your mother has spread false statements about you that have damaged your reputation or business, and intentional infliction of emotional distress based on the pattern of behaviour you've described." My heart was racing. Hearing a legal professional validate what I'd experienced, putting official names to the pain I'd carried for so long, felt both vindicating and terrifying. "What would that process look like?" I asked. Catherine leaned forward, her hands folded on her desk. "We'd file a civil lawsuit. There would be discovery where both sides gather evidence, depositions where you and your mother and potentially other family members would be questioned under oath, and eventually either a settlement or a trial. But, Amanda, I need you to understand what you're walking into." She paused, making sure she had my full attention. "Once you file, there's no going back. This will become public record. Your family will absolutely see this as betrayal. Your mother will retaliate, probably in ways you haven't imagined yet. Every painful moment of your childhood, every private family matter could be exposed in court. This process will be emotionally exhausting, expensive, and there's no guarantee of the outcome you want." She waited, watching my face. "Are you prepared for that?" I thought about my mother's face when she'd grabbed my hair. I thought about 35 years of being invisible, of being blamed for her unhappiness, of twisting myself into smaller and smaller shapes, trying to earn a love that was never going to come. I thought about that photo of Emily and my mother's rage when I'd asked about it. I thought about my father's death and being told it was my fault. "She's been retaliating my whole life," I said quietly. "I'm just finally fighting back." Catherine nodded slowly, and I saw something like respect in her eyes. "Then let's talk about what we need to do." Over the next hour, she outlined the process. We'd need to document everything, a comprehensive timeline of abuse, copies of all communications, witness statements if possible, financial records, medical records, if I'd sought treatment for anxiety or depression related to the abuse. "The stronger our documentation, the stronger our case," she explained. "We need to show pattern and intent, not just isolated incidents." I left her office with a retainer agreement, a list of tasks, and a strange sense of both dread and purpose. For the first time in my life, I was choosing to fight instead of flee. I was choosing to name what had been done to me instead of protecting the people who'd done it. That night, I sat at my dining table with my laptop and began the work of documentation. I downloaded every version of the wedding video I could find, saving them to multiple drives. I took screenshots of every message my mother had sent, every voicemail transcript, every text from family members attacking me. I printed bank statements showing the dates and times of transactions, proving I'd been nowhere near social media when the video was posted, that I'd received no money or compensation from its virality. The process was methodical and emotionally brutal. Reading through my mother's messages again, seeing the pattern of manipulation laid out in black and white, I felt waves of grief wash over me. This was my mother, the woman who was supposed to love me unconditionally, protect me, champion me. Instead, she'd spent decades tearing me down, and now that there were consequences for her actions, she was trying to destroy what little I'd managed to build. I organised everything into folders: physical assault, defamation, emotional abuse, financial impact, family dynamics. Each folder filled with evidence of a lifetime of pain. Around midnight, I opened my journal, the one I'd kept sporadically, over the years mostly filled with work notes and design sketches. I turned to a blank page and began writing not to my mother or my attorney or anyone else, but to myself. To the 7-year-old girl in Goodwill clothes watching her brother get everything new. To the 15-year-old girl being told her father's death was her fault. To the 27-year-old woman whose achievement had been turned into an extraction opportunity. Dear younger me, I wrote, I spent 30 years trying to earn love by being small, by being quiet, by being useful and undemanding and invisible. I thought if I could just shrink enough, if I could just be good enough, eventually she'd see me. Eventually she'd love me, but I understand now that her inability to love me was never about my worth. It was about her wounds. And I'm done paying for pain I didn't cause. Today, I choose to be whole, even if it means being alone. I choose truth over peace. I choose myself. I'm sorry it took me so long. I love you. I'm proud of you. You survived. And now, finally, you're going to live. I closed the journal and sat in the silence of my apartment. Through the window, Portland sparkled. In the darkness, thousands of lights marking thousands of lives, each carrying their own burdens and battles. Somewhere out there, my mother was probably awake too, probably crafting her next attack, her next narrative, her next attempt to make me the villain in a story where I'd only ever been trying to survive. Let her come. I was ready now. I didn't want revenge, I wanted truth. But first, she had to survive what came next. What came next arrived like a tsunami. I'd been preparing evidence for about a week, meeting with Catherine twice more to refine our strategy when my phone started exploding with messages from extended family members I rarely heard from. The first came from my Aunt Patricia, my mother's older sister, at 7 a.m. on a Saturday. How dare you extort your own mother? After everything she's done for you, you should be ashamed of yourself. I stared at the message confused. Extort. What was she talking about? Before I could even respond, more messages flooded in. My Uncle Richard. Your mother is in tears. 100K. Are you out of your mind? This is elder abuse, Amanda. My cousin Jennifer. Wow. I always knew you were jealous of your brother. But this is next level. Threatening to release more videos unless she pays you. You're disgusting. My cousin Michael. Mom says you're blackmailing Aunt Linda. Real classy. Hope the money's worth losing your family. The messages came faster than I could read them, each one more vicious than the last, each one referencing this supposed extortion that I knew nothing about. I called my Aunt Patricia back, my hand shaking. She answered on the first ring, her voice cold. What do you want, Amanda? She said. Aunt Pat, I don't know what Mum told you, but I'm not extorting anyone. I never asked her for money. I never threatened her with anything. There was a harsh laugh on the other end. Your mother called an emergency family meeting last night. She showed us the messages you sent, the threats you made. She's terrified of you. We all heard her, Amanda. She's broke, she's lost her job, and now you're demanding $100,000 or you'll release more videos to destroy what's left of her reputation." My stomach dropped. "That's not true. I never sent any messages like that. She's lying." But even as I said it, I could hear how defensive I sounded, how desperate. Aunt Patricia's voice turned sharp. "Your mother may have her flaws, but she's not a liar. You, on the other hand, have always been troubled, jealous, attention-seeking. This is just your latest stunt, and frankly, we're all done with your drama." She hung up before I could respond. I sat on my couch, my phone buzzing with incoming messages, and tried to process what was happening. My mother had called a family meeting, without me. And she told them I was extorting her. It was such a blatant, bold-faced lie that part of me couldn't believe anyone would fall for it. But they had. Every single one of them had believed her without question, without asking for my side, without even considering that she might be manipulating them. The messages kept coming and they got worse. My cousin Sarah, who I'd been close to as children. "You're an ungrateful bitch. Aunt Linda raised you alone and this is how you treat her. I hope you rot." My Uncle Tom, "Money, hungry snake, you've always been a user. Hope you're happy destroying this family." My Aunt Margaret, "Your father would be ashamed of you." That one hit hardest. My father, who'd been the only one who ever really saw me, weaponized against me by people who barely knew him. Within hours, I'd been blocked on Facebook, Instagram, and removed from every family group chat. My cousin Jennifer posted a vague status. "It's sad when family members betray their own blood for internet fame and money. Praying for my aunt during this difficult time." The post got 43 likes and dozens of supportive comments from relatives and family friends, all of them expressing sympathy for my mother and disgust for the unnamed villain. Me. I was being erased, excommunicated, turned into the family pariah based on lies my mother had told at a meeting I wasn't allowed to attend. The only message from my immediate family came from my brother. One line sent at noon. "Mom's right about you. Don't contact us again." No question, no doubt, just absolute certainty that I was the problem, that I'd always been the problem. Later that day, his wife posted on Facebook, "Some people will do anything for attention, even destroy the people who gave them life. Blood means nothing to narcissists." She didn't name me, but she didn't have to. Everyone knew. I started recording every phone call after that using an app Catherine had recommended. I took screenshots of every message, every social media post, every piece of evidence that showed the coordinated campaign against me. Some small, rational part of my brain understood that this was exactly what Catherine had warned me about. "Your mother will retaliate," she'd said, and she had brilliantly, by turning the entire family into her army. They weren't just defending her. They were attacking me with a fervour that felt almost religious, as if destroying me would somehow restore order to the family system. I'd started seeing a therapist 2 weeks earlier, a woman named Dr. Sharon Martinez, who specialised in family trauma. When I showed up for my appointment that week, barely holding myself together, she listened to everything that had happened and then said something that cracked my world open. "Amanda, they're not protecting your mother. They're protecting the system that makes them feel safe, even if it means sacrificing you." She leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Your family operates on a set of unspoken rules. Your mother is the matriarch. Your brother is the golden child. You're the scapegoat. Everyone has a role, and those roles keep the system balanced. When you stood up for yourself, when you threatened to expose the truth, you didn't just challenge your mother, you challenged the entire system." "But I didn't do anything wrong," I said, my voice breaking. "I know," Dr. Martinez said. "But in dysfunctional family systems, truth is less important than stability. They'd rather believe your mother's lies than face the reality that they've been complicit in your abuse for decades. Because if they admit you're telling the truth, they have to admit they failed you. They have to face their own guilt. It's easier to make you the villain." I spent the rest of that week in a fog of grief and anger. I'd known my family was dysfunctional. I'd known they'd always favoured my brother. But some naive part of me had believed that if I just showed them the truth, if I just made them see what my mother really was, they'd wake up. They'd support me. They'd finally choose me. Instead, they'd chosen her lies over my truth without a moment's hesitation. The speed and unanimity of their rejection was staggering. I wasn't just losing my mother. I was losing aunts and uncles and cousins, an entire extended family, everyone who'd ever claimed to love me. But I kept documenting. Every hateful message went into a folder. Every blocked account was noted. Every lie my mother told was recorded. Catherine had been right. This was evidence. Proof of a pattern. Proof that this wasn't about one bad day at a wedding. This was about a family system that required a scapegoat to function, and I'd refused to play that role anymore. Then, on a Tuesday evening, my phone rang from an unknown number, and the voice on the other end knew my mother better than anyone. "Is this Amanda Lopez?" the voice asked. It was male older with a slight tremor that suggested either nervousness or age. I almost didn't answer. After the barrage of family attacks, every unknown number felt like a potential ambush. But something in his tone, a gentleness that seemed genuine, made me respond. "Yes, this is Amanda," I said cautiously. "Who's calling?" "My name is Marcus Webb," he said. "I don't know if your mother ever mentioned me, but I used to work with her at Cascade Regional Healthcare. I was the CFO there until 2018. He paused, and I heard him take a breath. "I saw the video from your brother's wedding. And then I saw that your mother was terminated. I've been debating whether to reach out for weeks, but after I heard she was spreading lies about you to the family, I knew I had to call. Amanda, I need to tell you something about your mother. Something you deserve to know." I sat down slowly on my couch, my heart beginning to race. "What do you mean?" I asked. Marcus's voice grew steadier, as if he'd been preparing these words for a long time. "Your mother and I worked together for 8 years. She was brilliant at her job, charismatic, the kind of person everyone wanted to impress. I respected her enormously. But in 2017, I discovered some irregularities in the HR budget expenses that didn't quite add up. Nothing criminal, just sloppy bookkeeping that could have gotten the department in trouble during an audit. I mentioned it to her privately, offered to help her clean it up quietly before anyone else noticed." He paused again, and I could hear the pain in the silence. 2 weeks later, I was called into a meeting with the CEO and the head of legal. "Your mother had filed a formal complaint accusing me of sexual harassment. She claimed I'd made inappropriate comments about her appearance, that I touched her shoulder inappropriately during a meeting, that I'd sent her suggestive emails. All of it was fabricated, Amanda. Complete lies. But she'd been so meticulous. She had fake witnesses, colleagues she'd coached. She had emails that were edited to look inappropriate when taken out of context. She cried in that meeting. She was so convincing that even I almost believed her for a moment." My hands had gone cold. This was exactly what my mother had done to me, the same playbook on a different stage. "What happened?" I asked quietly. "I was suspended immediately," Marcus said. "The investigation took 2 years. 2 years of my life, Amanda. I lost my job, my reputation, my retirement savings paying for attorneys. My wife almost left me. My kids stopped speaking to me because they believed the accusations. It wasn't until 2020 that I was fully exonerated. They found evidence that your mother had doctored emails, that her witnesses had been coerced, that the whole thing was a fabrication designed to silence me before I could report the budget issues." "I'm so sorry," I whispered, and I meant it. I was looking at my own future, the scorched earth my mother left behind anyone who threatened her. "But here's what you need to understand," Marcus continued, his voice growing firmer. "I wasn't the first, and I wasn't the last. After my exoneration, 3 other people came forward, people your mother had targeted over the years. A woman named Jennifer, who'd been fired after your mother claimed she was stealing office supplies. A man named David, who'd been forced to resign after your mother spread rumours he was drinking on the job. Another woman, Sarah, who'd been pushed out after your mother convinced everyone she was mentally unstable. Every single one of them had done the same thing. They'd noticed something wrong, asked questions, or simply been too competent and made your mother feel threatened. I felt sick. She's done this to at least 4 people I know of, Marcus said, and those are just the ones who were brave enough to come forward after my case. Your mother has a pattern, Amanda. When she feels threatened when someone challenges her authority or exposes her mistakes, she doesn't reflect or apologise. She destroys them. She manufactures complaints, manipulates narratives, plays the victim so expertly that everyone rushes to protect her while the actual victim is left isolated and ruined. You're not her first target, he continued, and his voice was gentle now, almost paternal. You're just her closest. And that makes what she's done to you even more unconscionable. But Amanda, it also means you're not alone, and it means there's evidence, documentation, a pattern that proves this wasn't about stress or a bad day. This is who she is. This is what she does. I was crying now, silently, tears streaming down my face. For the first time since this nightmare began, someone who wasn't being paid to help me, someone who owed me nothing, was validating my reality. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Why now? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Because I've been waiting, he said finally. Waiting for someone brave enough to hold her accountable. When she was fired, I thought maybe that was enough. But then I heard she was blaming you, turning your family against you, doing to you what she'd done to all of us. And I realised that if I stayed silent, I'd be complicit. You're fighting back, Amanda. That takes more courage than you know. He cleared his throat. I have something for you. Documentation of your mother's workplace misconduct. Witness statements from the other people she targeted. Evidence that shows a pattern of calculated malice spanning over a decade. This isn't just about one assault at a wedding. This is about a woman who's been systematically destroying anyone who stands in her way, and it's time someone stopped her. My voice came out barely above a whisper. You'd be willing to testify, to go public with this? Absolutely, Marcus said without hesitation. My career is already destroyed. I have nothing left to lose. But more than that, I have a daughter your age. If someone did to her what your mother has done to you, I'd want someone to help her. Consider this my attempt to balance the scales. He paused. There's something else you should know. Years ago, before I understood who your mother really was, I had feelings for her. Nothing inappropriate while we were working together, but I thought perhaps after we both retired, maybe there could be something. I was a fool. The woman I thought I knew never existed. She was a carefully constructed facade, and underneath was someone capable of remarkable cruelty. His voice grew softer, weighted with regret. I'm sorry you had to learn that about your own mother. I can't imagine how much harder that must be. But I promise you, Amanda, you're doing the right thing. You're breaking a cycle that's destroyed too many lives already. We arranged to meet 2 days later at a coffee shop downtown. When I arrived, Marcus was already there, a tall man with silver hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. He stood when he saw me, shook my hand formally, and then slid a thick folder across the table. He handed me the folder, and inside was proof that my mother's lies went far beyond family. The folder Marcus handed me was 3 inches thick, organised with the precision of someone who'd spent years in corporate finance. Inside were witness statements, notarized and dated from 4 different people my mother had targeted during her tenure at Cascade Regional Healthcare. There were email chains showing her pattern of manipulation, HR complaints she'd filed that were later proven false, and a timeline that stretched back 15 years. Each incident followed the same blueprint. Someone threatened her authority, or discovered her mistakes, and she systematically destroyed them with false accusations, manufactured evidence, and a performance of victimhood so convincing that everyone rallied to protect her while her target was cast out. I took the folder directly to Catherine's office the next morning. She spent 2 hours going through every page, making notes, occasionally looking up at me with an expression that shifted between professional satisfaction and human sadness. "This is extraordinary," she said finally. "This establishes clear pattern evidence. It shows premeditation, calculation, and a history of this exact behavior in professional settings. Combined with what happened to you, we can demonstrate that the wedding incident wasn't an isolated loss of control. It was consistent with a lifelong pattern of abusing anyone who threatened her sense of control." Over the next 3 weeks, we worked systematically to build the case. Marcus connected me with the other victims, and I spent hours on video calls listening to their stories. Jennifer, who'd been accused of stealing office supplies, broke down crying when she told me how the accusation had followed her for years, how potential employers would Google her name and find the old allegations. David, accused of drinking on the job, had lost his marriage and his relationship with his children. Sarah, labelled mentally unstable, had spent 2 years in therapy, trying to rebuild her sense of reality after my mother's gaslighting campaign. Each of them agreed to provide sworn statements. Each of them had been waiting for someone to finally hold my mother accountable. My best friend Sarah, who'd stuck by me through everything, worked as an investigative journalist for a regional news outlet. When I told her about Marcus and the pattern we'd uncovered, her eyes lit up with that particular intensity journalists get when they smell a real story. "This isn't just family drama," she said. "This is a public interest story about patterns of abuse, workplace misconduct, and accountability. Let me pitch this to my editor." Within a week, she'd gotten approval to write a comprehensive piece about familial abuse going viral, and the larger questions it raised about how we respond to documented violence, especially when the perpetrator is someone respected in their community. Sarah started interviewing experts on family dynamics, abuse patterns, and the psychology of scapegoating. She verified every fact, contacted Cascade Regional Healthcare for comment, and reached out to the other victims Marcus had connected us with. "We're going to run this in about 2 weeks," she told me. "It's going to be Big Amanda. Are you ready for that?" I thought about going from a viral video victim to someone actively telling their story, choosing exposure rather than having it forced upon me. "Yes," I said. "I'm ready." But my mother was gathering intelligence too. I don't know how she found out about my design business. Maybe someone from my distant professional network knew someone in the family. Maybe she'd been digging into my life more thoroughly than I realised. But somehow she discovered that I wasn't the struggling, disappointing failure she'd always believed me to be, and she moved quickly to destroy what I'd built. My biggest client, a tech executive renovating a historic home in the West Hills, called me on a Wednesday afternoon. His voice was uncomfortable, apologetic. "Amanda, I received a very concerning phone call yesterday from someone claiming to be your aunt. She said you've been experiencing severe mental health issues, that you were recently hospitalised, and that she was worried about your ability to complete our project safely." My stomach dropped. "Mr. Patterson, I don't have an aunt who would call you. That was my mother. Everything she told you is a lie." There was a long pause. "She seemed very convincing," he said slowly. "She knew details about you, about your business. She said she was calling out of a concern because you'd been making threats against family members, that there were legal issues." I could hear him wavering, and I hated the desperation in my own voice when I responded. "Mr. Patterson, I'm currently building a legal case against my mother for assault and defamation. She's retaliating by trying to destroy my business. I can provide documentation, character references, anything you need to verify that I'm completely capable of completing your project." But the seed of doubt had been planted. "I think we need to put the project on hold for now," he said. "Just until things settle down. I'm sure you understand." The project was worth $200,000, my biggest contract ever, and it evaporated with that phone call. Over the next week, 2 more clients called with similar concerns. Someone claiming to be a worried family member had contacted them raising questions about my stability, my reliability, my mental health. Both projects were suspended. One client terminated our contract entirely. I was furious, but I was also grimly triumphant. "She's doing it again," I told Catherine, showing her the documentation of the calls, the timing, the pattern. "She's using the exact same tactics she used on Marcus and the others. She finds out someone is threatening her and she launches a preemptive strike to destroy their credibility and livelihood." Catherine nodded, making notes. "This is actually helpful for our case. It shows ongoing harassment and interference with your business. Every call she makes, every lie she tells, strengthens our position. She's quite literally proving our case for us." I reached out to each client who'd been contacted, explained the situation calmly and professionally, provided them with context about the viral video and my mother's termination, and assured them I was taking legal action. One client reinstated our contract immediately, apologizing for doubting me. The other 2 remained skeptical, but they didn't terminate entirely. "She's proving my case for me," I told Catherine during our next meeting, and I meant it. Every desperate action my mother took, every lie she spread, every attempt to destroy me only added to the mountain of evidence showing exactly who she was. Sarah's article was scheduled to run in 5 days. Marcus had agreed to be interviewed on the record. 2 of the other workplace victims had agreed as well. The piece would include expert commentary, legal analysis, and a comprehensive timeline of my mother's pattern of abuse. I was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. This was it. The truth was about to become public in a way I controlled, not in a viral video I never asked for, but in a carefully reported story that showed the full scope of what my mother was capable of. But before the article could be published, my doorbell rang at 11 p.m, and my mother stood there with a final ultimatum. I looked through the peephole and saw her standing in the hallway, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lighting. She looked terrible. Her hair was unwashed and hanging limp around her face. She wore sweatpants and an old cardigan clothes I'd never seen her wear in public. Her face was gaunt-aged in a way that made her look 10 years older than she was. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize her. This wasn't the polished HR director who commanded respect in boardrooms. This was a woman who looked broken. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave the door locked, I opened it. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes and her face crumpled. "Amanda," she whispered, "please, can I come in just for a minute? I need to talk to you." I should have said no. I should have closed the door and called Catherine. But that little girl inside me, the one who'd spent 35 years hoping for her mother's love, made me step aside. She walked in, slowly moving like someone much older, and stood in my living room wringing her hands. "I know you hate me," she began, her voice trembling. "I know I've been a terrible mother. I know I hurt you at the wedding. I was wrong, Amanda. I was so wrong." Tears started streaming down her face, and she looked so small, so defeated that something in my chest twisted painfully. "I'm your mother," she continued, her voice breaking. "I gave birth to you. I raised you. I know I made mistakes, but please, please don't destroy me. That article Sarah's writing, the lawsuit you're planning, it's going to ruin what's left of my life. I'm begging you, have mercy." I stood frozen, watching her cry, and felt my resolve beginning to waver. This was what I'd always wanted, wasn't it, for her to acknowledge what she'd done, for her to apologize, for her to finally see me. "Mum," I said quietly, and my voice sounded like a child's voice, small and hopeful. "If you really mean this, if you really want to make things right, we can figure something out. But you have to stop lying about me. You have to stop trying to destroy my business. You have to tell the family the truth." She nodded eagerly, taking a step toward me. Yes, I will. I'll fix everything. Just call off the article. Drop the lawsuit. We can work this out privately as a family. You don't need lawyers and journalists involved. This is between us. She reached for my hands, and I let her take them, feeling the familiar shape of her fingers, remembering being 5 years old and holding these same hands while crossing the street. I'm sorry, she whispered again. I'm so sorry. For just a moment, I believed her. For just a moment, I thought maybe this was real. Maybe she'd finally reached some kind of breaking point that had cracked through her defenses and let real remorse emerge. But then I saw it. The calculation in her eyes. The way she was watching me, gauging my reaction, adjusting her performance based on what she saw. And something inside me went cold and clear. You're not sorry, I said, pulling my hands away. You're just scared. Her face changed instantly. The grief vanished, replaced by something hard and angry. Of course I'm scared, she hissed. You're trying to destroy me. After everything I've done for you. You owe me your life, Amanda. Do you understand that I gave you life? I raised you alone after your father died. Her voice was rising now, the mask slipping completely. I saved you once when you were drowning at age 3. You fell into a pool at a birthday party and I jumped in and pulled you out. I saved your life. I should have let you drown like... She stopped abruptly, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes going wide with horror at what she'd almost said. The world seemed to stop. Like who, Mom? I asked, my voice eerily calm. Like who should I have drowned with? She backed away from me, shaking her head. No, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. But her face told a different story. I could see grief and rage and something else, something desperate and raw contorting her features. Like who? I repeated louder now. Tell me. Was it Emily? The baby in the photo I found when I was 12? The one you wouldn't talk about? Stop, she said, her voice breaking. You don't understand. You can't understand. But I was done backing down. Then make me understand, I said. Tell me the truth. Who was Emily? She looked at me with such anguish that for a second I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then her expression hardened again and she straightened her spine. You want the truth? She said coldly. Fine. Emily was my first daughter, your twin sister. She drowned when you were both 3 years old. I couldn't save both of you. I had to choose. And every day since I've wondered if I chose wrong. The words hit me like a physical blow. I staggered backward, grabbing the back of the couch for support. A twin sister. Emily was my twin, and she'd drowned. And my mother had spent 35 years resenting me for surviving. Get out, I said quietly. My mother blinked, surprised. What? She said. Get out of my apartment. I repeated, my voice steady now, despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. And never come back uninvited. We're done here. Amanda, wait, she started, but I walked to the door and opened it. Now, I said. She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw her trying to decide which tactic to use next. Tears, rage, more manipulation, but something in my face must have told her it wouldn't work this time. She grabbed her purse and walked to the door, pausing in the threshold. You'll regret this, she said, and this time there was no performance in her voice, just cold, hard truth. You're making a terrible mistake. The only mistake I made was opening the door, I said, and closed it in her face. I locked it, then slid the chain into place, then stood there shaking. After a moment, I noticed something on the floor near where my mother had been standing. A small leather journal, worn and old, lying face down on my carpet. Had she dropped it? Left it deliberately? I picked it up with trembling hands and opened to a random page. The handwriting was my mother's, younger and less controlled than her current precise script. Amanda looks exactly like her, the entry read, dated 32 years ago. Every day I see my first daughter's face in this child. The same eyes, the same serious expression, I saved her from the water, but I couldn't save... The entry ended. There the sentence unfinished ink smudged as if she'd been crying while writing it. My hands trembled as I realised my mother had been grieving someone else her entire life. But who I spent the next 3 days in a fog, my mother's journal sitting on my coffee table like a bomb I was afraid to touch. Emily, my twin sister, a whole person who'd existed, who'd shared a womb with me, who died when we were 3 years old and I had no memory of her. I'd been living my entire life as a replacement for a dead child, a constant reminder of the daughter my mother couldn't save. Every time she looked at me, she saw the sister. I'd lost the choice she'd had to make in the water. No wonder she'd hated me. No wonder nothing I did was ever enough. Sarah called me the morning the article was scheduled to run. "It's live," she said quietly. "Are you ready?" I wasn't. I would never be ready. But I said yes anyway because there was no turning back now. I opened my laptop with shaking hands and navigated to the news outlet's website. There it was, the top story with a headline that made everything feel suddenly terrifyingly real. When family violence goes viral, one woman's fight for accountability. The article was comprehensive and devastating. Sarah had done her job brilliantly weaving together the wedding video, my documented evidence of my mother's defamation campaign against my business expert commentary from psychologists specialising in family trauma and legal analysis about accountability for public assault. But what made it truly powerful were the testimonies from Marcus and 2 other former colleagues of my mother. Their stories, laid out in careful detail, showed an undeniable pattern spanning 15 years. A woman who, when threatened or challenged, systematically destroyed people through false accusations, manufactured evidence and performances of victimhood so convincing that entire organisations rallied to protect her while her victims were discarded. The article didn't sensationalise. It didn't need to. The facts were damning enough. Sarah had framed it not as family gossip, but as a public interest story about what happens when abuse goes viral, about the systems that protect abusers while silencing victims, about the courage it takes to hold powerful people accountable, even when they're your own mother. She'd interviewed domestic violence advocates who spoke about patterns of familial abuse, about scapegoating, about the difficulty adult children face when they finally speak up about parental abuse, because society expects unconditional forgiveness and reconciliation. My phone started buzzing within minutes of the article going live. Text messages, emails, social media notifications, climbing into the hundreds, then thousands. I watched the share count climb 5,000, 10,000, 20,000. By noon, it had been shared over 50,000 times. The comments section filled with thousands of responses, and unlike the chaos of the original viral video, these comments were different. Thoughtful, supportive, validating. "This happened to me with my father. Thank you for speaking up. I'm a therapist and I see this pattern constantly. The family always protects the abuser. This woman is so brave. I hope she gets the justice she deserves." Comment after comment from people sharing their own stories of family abuse, of being scapegoated, of finally standing up and being called vindictive or ungrateful for it. I read a few and then had to close the browser because I was crying too hard to see the screen. Within hours, 3 different domestic violence organisations reached out asking if I'd be willing to speak at events or participate in advocacy campaigns. A literary agent emailed asking if I'd ever considered writing a book. 2 different podcasts requested interviews. And most touching, I received personal messages from 2 other adult children of abusive parents, both saying my story had given them the courage to finally report their own situations, to stop protecting the people who'd hurt them. But I wasn't ready to be a public figure, a spokesperson, a symbol. I was just a woman trying to survive telling the truth. I declined all interview requests, thanked the organisations, but said I needed time, and ignored most of the notifications flooding my devices. The only public statement I made was on LinkedIn, where my professional contacts and clients could see it, where it mattered for my business and my reputation. I wrote one simple paragraph and posted it without ceremony. For years, I stayed quiet to keep the peace, but peace built on my silence was never real peace. Speaking up has cost me my family, tested my business, and exposed my most painful moments to millions of strangers. But silence was costing me my soul. To everyone who's ever been told to forgive and forget, to keep family business private, to protect people who hurt you, your truth matters. Your pain matters. You matter. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to be silent anymore. The post got over 15,000 reactions in the first day. Former clients reached out to express support. Professional contacts I barely knew sent messages saying they'd had similar experiences with family. The client who'd put my project on hold called to apologize and reinstate the contract immediately. "I should have trusted you," he said. "I'm sorry I let your mother's lies influence me." I was sitting at my kitchen table staring at my laptop screen and trying to process the sheer magnitude of what was happening when my phone rang. An unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Amanda Lopez," a woman's voice said, professional and crisp. "This is Jennifer Huang from the Portland Tribune. I'm calling for comment on a press conference your mother is holding in 1 hour. She's claiming the article published today is filled with lies and defamation, and that she's filing a lawsuit against you, the news outlet, and everyone quoted in the story. Would you like to respond?" My blood went cold. Of course, this was how she'd react. Not with reflection or remorse, but with aggression, with another performance, with a counterattack designed to make herself the victim once again. "No comment," I said automatically, then ended the call and immediately dialed Catherine. "I saw," Catherine said before I could speak. "I'm already drafting a response. Amanda, this is actually good for us. Everything she says at that press conference will be discoverable in our lawsuit. She's creating evidence against herself." But I barely heard her. All I could think was that this wasn't over. It would never be over. My mother would fight until one of us was completely destroyed. My mother's response came within hours, but it wasn't an apology. It was a declaration of war. I watched the press conference live on my laptop, my stomach churning with a mixture of dread and disbelief. My mother stood behind a podium at a budget hotel conference room, flanked by a man in an ill-fitting suit who introduced himself as her media consultant. She looked composed, almost regal, wearing a black dress and pearls, her hair professionally styled. This was the mother I recognized from her corporate life, the one who commanded rooms and convinced everyone of whatever reality she wanted them to believe. "I'm here today to set the record straight," she began, her voice steady and clear. "The article published yesterday is filled with lies and fabrications orchestrated by my daughter, who has struggled with mental health issues for years. I love Amanda deeply, but she's been experiencing a severe psychological episode, and instead of getting her the help she needs, certain individuals have exploited her instability for clicks and attention." She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. The performance so polished I almost believed she'd actually cried. The so-called evidence presented in that article has been taken out of context or outright fabricated. The incident at my son's wedding was blown out of proportion. Yes, I touched my daughter's arm to get her attention during a difficult moment, but the video has been edited to make it appear violent. I'm devastated that my private family matter has been weaponized against me. Then came the part that made my blood run cold. Her consultant held up a document, positioning it for the cameras. "We have medical records showing that Amanda was treated for delusional disorder in 2015, my mother continued. "She has a documented history of false accusations and paranoid thinking. Her therapist at the time noted concerns about her detachment from reality. I'm sharing this not to hurt my daughter, but because the public deserves to know the context behind these allegations." The document showed my name, a diagnosis, treatment dates, medication prescriptions. It looked official, complete with a clinic letterhead and doctor's signature. Except I'd never been treated for any psychiatric condition in 2015. I'd never even heard of the clinic mentioned on that letterhead. Within 20 minutes of the press conference ending, low-credibility news sites and gossip blogs began running headlines that made me feel sick. Daughter's revenge plot, fake abuse claims for social media clout, one screamed. Family insiders say daughter has history of mental instability, claimed another. The narrative was shifting, splitting into competing versions of reality. In one version, I was a brave survivor holding an abuser accountable. In another, I was a mentally unstable woman fabricating abuse for attention and profit. My work email started receiving messages, anonymous complaints sent to the general office address. Are you aware that Amanda Lopez has documented psychiatric issues? One read. I'm concerned about her stability and whether she should be working with vulnerable clients in their homes. Another said, I saw the press conference. You're employing someone who makes false accusations for internet fame. Thought you should know. I forwarded everything to Catherine, my hands shaking with rage. Then, my brother's wife entered the battle. She posted a long Facebook rant with a recording attached, and within hours it had been shared thousands of times in circles that wanted to believe my mother's version of events. I'm done staying silent, her post began. Amanda has been threatening this family for months. She's demanded money, threatened to destroy my mother-in-law's reputation, and made our lives a living hell. Here's a recording of her screaming threats at me over the phone. The attached audio clip was my voice unmistakably yelling something that sounded like, I'll make you pay for this. You'll all be sorry. It was so clearly manipulated that it was almost laughable, except people were believing it. The audio was choppy, obviously edited. My words stitched together from different contexts to create a narrative that had never existed. I immediately called Catherine. I need you to listen to something, I said and played her the recording. She was silent for a moment. Then I heard her typing. Send me the link. We'll have an audio forensics expert analyse it. This is blatant evidence tampering, Amanda. Between this and the fake medical records, your mother is committing multiple crimes. I took screenshots of everything, downloaded the audio file, documented the spread of the manipulated recording across social media. Then I drove to the clinic mentioned on the fake medical records, the one where I'd supposedly been treated in 2015. The address led me to a strip mall in Beaverton. The suite number on the letterhead didn't exist. Suite 240 was actually a nail salon. I took photos, got a statement from the property manager confirming no mental health clinic had ever operated at that location. I checked the medical licensing board for the doctor whose signature appeared on the records. No such physician was licensed in Oregon. The whole thing was a forgery, and not even a particularly good one. I filed a police report for identity fraud and falsification of medical records. The officer who took my statement was sympathetic, but ultimately unhelpful. This is really a civil matter, he said. You'd need to sue her for defamation. We can document the report, but criminal charges for something like this are complicated. I left the police station feeling defeated, but Catherine's response when I sent her everything was different. This is actually perfect, she said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. She's panicking. She's making mistakes. Every fake document, every manipulated recording, every lie she tells in public is evidence of her character and her pattern of behaviour. She's literally digging her own grave, Amanda. Let her keep going. But it didn't feel like winning. It felt like drowning. Half the internet believed I was a hero. The other half believed I was a liar. My professional reputation was being attacked. My mental health was being questioned. And somewhere in the middle of all this noise was the truth, a woman who'd been abused her entire life by a mother who was now using every weapon in her arsenal to destroy her daughter rather than face accountability. I sat in my apartment that night, surrounded by documents and screenshots, and evidence feeling the weight of it all pressing down on me. How much more could I take? How much longer could I keep fighting? Then an anonymous email arrived with subject line, "You need to see this," and an attachment that would change everything. My cursor hovered over the email for a long moment, every instinct screaming that this could be another trap, another manipulated piece of evidence designed to hurt me. The sender was listed only as a friend, and the message was brief, "Ms. Lopez, I've debated sending this for months. After seeing what your mother is doing to you now, I can't stay silent anymore. This footage is from the wedding. It's unedited and time-stamped. I'm sorry for what you've endured. You deserved better." I took a breath and clicked on the video attachment. The footage opened onto wide angle of the wedding reception, the timestamp showing it was recorded about 10 minutes before the hair-pulling incident. The quality was professional, clearly shot on high-end equipment, and the audio was crisp and clear. I could see myself in the background standing alone near the bar, with my glass of sparkling water trying to be invisible. My brother and his new wife were greeting guests on the other side of the room, and there, in the foreground, was my mother talking to my Aunt Patricia. I turned up the volume and heard my mother's voice casual and conversational. "She showed up in that awful dress," my mother was saying, gesturing vaguely in my direction. "I swear she does this on purpose. Can't let her brother have one day without making it about her." My aunt made some reply I couldn't quite hear, and my mother laughed. Then she said something that made my entire body go cold. "Watch this. She needs to be put in her place in front of everyone. I'm done pretending she's a functioning adult." I paused the video, my hand shaking so badly I could barely control the mouse. There it was, premeditation, intent. She told my aunt what she was planning to do before she did it. This wasn't a stressed mother losing control in a moment of overwhelm. This was a calculated decision to humiliate me publicly, announced in advance like she was planning entertainment for the reception. I forced myself to keep watching. The video cut ahead to the moment after the assault, after I'd left the reception hall. The angle captured my mother's face as she turned back to the guests who were still standing in shocked silence. And there, it was, clear as day, a smirk. Small, satisfied, quickly suppressed, but unmistakable. She was pleased with herself. Then her expression shifted into something softer, more vulnerable, and she brought her hand to her chest in that gesture I knew so well. "I am so sorry everyone had to see that," she said, her voice trembling perfectly. "Amanda and I have had such a difficult relationship. She's always struggled with certain issues, and sometimes she just pushes me too far. I shouldn't have reacted that way, but you all know how hard it's been." Guests murmured sympathetically. Several people approached to comfort her. My brother put his arm around her, and my mother stood there, accepting their sympathy, dabbing at eyes that showed no actual tears, playing the role of the long-suffering mother pushed to her breaking point by her troubled daughter. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and every second of it was recorded in high definition with crystal clear audio. The video ended and a text document opened automatically. "Ms. Lopez," it read, "my name is David Chen. I was the lead videographer for your brother's wedding. I'm sending this anonymously because I'm not supposed to share client footage, but after everything I've seen, I can't stay silent. Your mother doesn't remember me, but we've met before. In 2019, I worked as a production coordinator at a marketing firm that contracted with Cascade Regional Healthcare. Your mother had me fired with false accusations of inappropriate behaviour after I questioned some inconsistencies in her department's budget reports. It took me a year to find steady work again," he continued. "When I saw her name on the wedding booking, I made sure every angle was covered. I positioned backup cameras specifically to capture audio and wide shots that the main cameras might miss. I wanted documentation in case she tried anything, though I never imagined she'd assault her own daughter. I've held on to this footage because I wasn't sure what to do with it. But watching her hold that press conference, watching her produce fake medical records and manipulate audio to destroy you the same way she destroyed me, I knew I had to send this. The timestamp is verified. The footage is unedited. This is the truth. I sat back in my chair and watched the video 2 more times, and with each viewing, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just evidence. This was vindication. This was proof that I wasn't crazy, wasn't oversensitive, wasn't misremembering or exaggerating. My mother had planned to humiliate me. She'd announced her intention to do it. She'd executed her plan in front of 150 witnesses, and then she'd immediately performed victimhood to make herself sympathetic while painting me as the problem. It was exactly what Marcus had described, exactly what she'd done to him and Jennifer and David and Sarah and countless others. It was her pattern, her method, her signature move, and now it was documented with timestamps and unimpeachable video evidence. I cried then, but not from sadness, from relief, from the overwhelming validation of finally having proof that couldn't be twisted or denied or explained away. I cried for the little girl I'd been who'd spent 35 years wondering what was wrong with her that made her mother hate her so much. I cried for everyone my mother had destroyed with these same tactics, and I cried because this video would help ensure she couldn't destroy anyone else. I immediately forwarded the email to Catherine with a message, "This is it. This is everything we need." Then I sent it to Sarah, to Dr. Martinez, to Marcus. I downloaded the video to 3 different drives and uploaded it to a secure cloud server. I called the police department and asked to reopen my harassment report with new evidence. The officer who'd taken my initial report called me back within an hour after reviewing the footage. "Ms. Lopez," he said, his tone completely different now. "We're going to need you to come in and give a full statement. This video changes things significantly." I sat in my apartment as the sun set over Portland. The video paused on the frame of my mother's smirk, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months, certainty. The doubt that had plagued me, the voice that whispered, maybe I was overreacting, maybe it wasn't that bad, maybe I was being vindictive, all of it evaporated. I had the truth, now documented and time-stamped and undeniable. I finally had the proof, and I knew exactly what I had to do next. What I needed to do next was make it official, make it permanent, make it impossible for my mother to rewrite this history the way she'd rewritten everything else in my life. 2 days after receiving David Chen's video, I sat in Catherine's office and signed the papers that would transform my private pain into public record. The lawsuit named my mother as defendant and laid out 5 distinct causes of action, each one documented with evidence that had taken months to compile. Count 1 was assault and battery, supported by the original viral video, David Chen's footage showing premeditation, and witness statements from guests who'd seen the attack. Count 2 was defamation based on the false psychiatric records my mother had produced at her press conference, the manipulated audio, recording my sister-in-law had posted, and documented instances of my mother telling clients and colleagues I was mentally unstable. Count 3 was intentional infliction of emotional distress, encompassing the decades of differential treatment. The pattern of abuse documented in my own testimony and corroborated by family photos and school records, showing the disparate treatment between me and my brother. Count 4 was interference with business relations, supported by phone records and client statements about my mother's calls claiming I was unfit to work the contracts I'd lost and the financial damage to my design business. Count 5 was fraud centered on the forged medical records that didn't just defame me but constituted criminal falsification of documents. Together, these 5 counts painted a comprehensive picture of a woman who'd spent 35 years abusing her daughter, and when that daughter finally fought back, had escalated to criminal behaviour in her desperation to maintain control. "This isn't about money," Catherine explained as I reviewed the filing one last time, though we were requesting damages totalling $300,000 for lost business emotional distress and punitive damages. Though damages could be substantial if we win, This is about creating a legal record of the pattern of abuse. This is about getting court to officially recognize what was done to you. And this is about getting an injunction that legally prevents her from continuing to harass and defame you. We were requesting a restraining order that would prohibit my mother from contacting me, from contacting my clients or employers, and from making any public statements about me or my mental health. The lawsuit was filed on a Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon, the local legal community was buzzing about it. It wasn't common for adult children to sue their parents for this combination of claims. Family law attorneys were fascinated by the intentional infliction of emotional distress argument based on lifetime patterns rather than single incidents. The criminal fraud element made it even more unusual. Within a week, I learned that the local bar association was planning to use our case as an example in their continuing legal education course on familial abuse litigation and the challenges of proving long-term psychological harm in civil court. But the court of public opinion was far less measured. The family members who'd already turned against me found new ammunition in the lawsuit. My Uncle Richard posted on Facebook, "Amanda is suing her own mother for $300,000. This is elder abuse, pure and simple. Linda is 58 years old, unemployed, and her vindictive daughter is trying to take what little she has left. Disgusting." My cousin Jennifer called me directly, the only family member besides my mother who tried to contact me in weeks, and screamed into the phone, "You're destroying an old woman over a few seconds of video. You're greedy and you're cruel and you're going to hell for this." I recorded the call, added it to our evidence folder and blocked her number. But for every family member who condemned me, there were strangers who supported me. Domestic violence organisations sent statements praising my courage. 3 different survivors' advocacy groups offered to file amicus briefs if the case went to trial. A law professor from Lewis and Clark wrote an op-ed about the importance of adult children being able to seek legal recourse for parental abuse, using my case as the central example. The comment sections were still split, but the balance was shifting. More people were starting to understand that this wasn't about a wedding incident. This was about accountability for a lifetime of systematic abuse. Catherine called me into her office 6 weeks after we filed her expression serious. "Amanda, I need to prepare you for what's coming. Discovery is going to be extensive and invasive. Your mother's attorney will request access to your medical records, your therapy notes, your financial records, everything. They'll depose you, your brother, family members, anyone who knew you growing up. They'll try to find anything they can use to paint you as unstable, vindictive, or financially motivated." She paused, leaning forward. "And they're going to dig into your family history, your father's death, your mother's past, anything that might explain or excuse her behaviour." I thought about the journal I'd found about Emily, about the twin sister I'd never known existed who drowned when we were 3. "There are things I don't know yet," I said slowly. "Things about my family that my mother has kept hidden. I'm afraid of what might come out." Catherine nodded. "I know, but here's what I need you to understand. Whatever comes out, whatever painful truths emerge during discovery, we can handle it. The question is whether you're prepared to face it. Are you prepared for everything to come out, including things about your father, your family history, things that might change how you understand your entire childhood?" I looked out the window of her office at the city below, at all those people living their lives carrying their own hidden wounds and buried secrets. I thought about the little girl I'd been desperate for answers about why her mother hated her. I thought about the woman I'd become strong enough to demand those answers even if they destroyed me. "I need to know the truth," I said finally. "Whatever it is, even if it breaks me. I've spent my whole life living in the shadow of secrets and lies. I'd rather know the truth and learn to live with it than spend one more day wondering." Catherine made a note in her file. "Then we move forward. Discovery will take 6 to 8 months. Your mother will fight every step of the way. This is going to get worse before it gets better. I nodded, and she studied my face for a long moment. You know, in 20 years of practicing law, I've never seen anyone as prepared for this battle as you are. You've done the work, you've built the case, you've faced the ugliest parts of your history. Whatever happens next, you're going to survive it. But as I left her office that day, I had no idea how prophetic those words would be. What I didn't know was that the truth had been buried for 35 years, and it would break her heart before it set her free. The truth, whatever it was, would have to wait through 6 months of legal manoeuvring depositions and discovery requests that felt designed to break my spirit. I spent those months rebuilding. I took on new design projects, smaller ones at first, then gradually larger, as my confidence returned and word spread that the fake medical records had been proven fraudulent. I attended therapy every week, sometimes twice a week, when the legal stress became overwhelming. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that healing wasn't about waiting for the trial to be over. It was about learning to live fully, even while the battle raged around me. I took up running again, something I'd abandoned years ago. I reconnected with old friends who'd reached out after the article. I lived quietly, deliberately building a life that wasn't defined by my mother's abuse or my fight against it. And then, finally, it was time. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in October, 10 months after my brother's wedding. The courthouse steps were crowded with people I didn't know, reporters with cameras and notebooks, domestic violence advocates, holding signs that read, "We believe survivors," and "Accountability matters." Catherine had warned me it would be a spectacle, but seeing it in person made my stomach churn. Inside the courtroom was packed to capacity. Every seat in the gallery was filled with a mixture of media representatives, curious onlookers, and people who'd followed my story from the beginning. I recognised a few faces from the abuse survivor community, people who'd reached out over the months to share their own stories. My mother sat at the defence table with her attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Brennan, who specialised in defending high-profile clients accused of misconduct. My mother looked small and fragile, wearing a conservative navy suit and minimal makeup. Her hair was styled simply, pulled back in a way that made her look older and more vulnerable. She kept a tissue in her hand, occasionally dabbing at her eyes, the picture of a grieving, overwhelmed woman being persecuted by her vindictive daughter. I'd seen this performance before, but it still made me angry how effective it was. The first 2 days were procedural jury selection and opening statements. Patricia Brennan's strategy became immediately clear. She wasn't going to claim my mother hadn't grabbed my hair. She wasn't going to deny the video existed. Instead, she was going to reframe the entire narrative. Linda Lopez is a widow, she told the jury, her voice rich with sympathy. A woman who raised 2 children alone after losing her husband tragically when her daughter was only 15. She worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads. She sacrificed everything to give her children opportunities. And yes, at her son's wedding, after years of difficult interactions with her daughter, after 1 glass too many of champagne, after the stress of planning and paying for that wedding, she lost her temper for 5 seconds. 5 seconds that have been used to destroy her entire life. Brennan painted my mother as a struggling single parent who'd done her best under impossible circumstances, a woman who'd made 1 regrettable mistake in a moment of stress, a woman now being sued for $300,000 by a daughter looking for a payday. She mentioned the manipulated audio and fake medical records, only briefly framing them as desperate attempts by a terrified mother to defend herself against a coordinated media campaign. It was masterful, and I watched several jurors nodding along. Then came the witnesses. My mother's attorney called character witnesses, first people who'd known my mother professionally, who described her as dedicated, hardworking, respected. A former colleague from Cascade Regional talked about how devastated my mother had been when she was terminated. Then, on the 3rd day, they called a witness I hadn't expected, Mrs. Peterson, our neighbour from when I was growing up. I watched Mrs. Peterson, take the stand, a woman in her 70s, now moving slowly with a cane. I remembered her as kind, someone who'd waved to me when I played in the yard, who'd once given me homemade cookies when she saw me sitting alone on the porch. My stomach tightened as she was sworn in. Mrs. Peterson, Brennan began warmly, how long did you live next door to the Lopez family? Mrs. Peterson's voice was thin but clear. Oh, about 8 years, from when Amanda was about 8 until the family moved when she was 16. 16, I went still. We'd moved when I was 9, not 16. And during those years, what was your impression of the family dynamic? Brennan asked. Mrs. Peterson sighed, shaking her head sadly. That poor Linda. She tried so hard with Amanda, but that girl was troubled from the start. Always defiant, always causing problems. I remember Amanda screaming at her mother, slamming doors, running away from home several times. Linda was a saint to put up with it. I used to tell my husband that woman deserves a medal for dealing with such a difficult child. I felt the blood drain from my face. None of that was true. I'd never run away from home. I'd been quiet, obedient to a fault, desperate not to cause any trouble that would give my mother more reasons to hate me. I looked at Catherine, panic rising in my chest, but she was taking notes calmly, her expression neutral. And Amanda's room, Brennan continued. Can you describe it? Mrs. Peterson nodded. Oh yes, I was in that house many times. Amanda's room was on the second floor, painted pink, with butterfly decals on the walls. She had a little desk by the window. I remember because I could see it from my upstairs bathroom. She was describing a room that had never been mine. My room had been small at the back of the house, painted beige, because my mother said I didn't deserve to choose colours. There had been no desk, no butterfly decals. Mrs. Peterson was either confusing me with someone else or she was lying. But why? She'd always seemed kind to me. During the lunch recess, I grabbed Catherine's arm. She's lying, I said desperately. None of that is true. We moved when I was 9, not 16. That room she described was never mine. Why would Mrs. Peterson lie? Catherine guided me to a quiet corner. Amanda, I need you to trust me right now. Let her talk. Let her describe all these details she's so confident about. I stared at her. But the jury believes her. I can see it on their faces. She seems credible. Catherine's eyes held something that looked almost like satisfaction. She seems credible because she believes what she's saying. But she's about to make a mistake. Just trust me. Because the truth had one more layer to reveal, and it would unravel in the next 24 hours. That truth began to unravel the next morning when Catherine called me to the stand. I'd been preparing for this moment for months, practicing with Catherine, role-playing with Dr. Martinez, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality of walking to that witness box with every eye in the courtroom fixed on me. I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And I meant it with every fibre of my being. Catherine started gently establishing basic facts about my childhood, my education, my career. Then she moved into harder territory. Amanda, can you describe the differential treatment between you and your brother growing up? She asked. I took a breath and began to speak, keeping my voice steady and factual. My brother received new clothes for school every year. I wore hand-me-downs from cousins or clothes from Goodwill. He had a college fund that my mother contributed to monthly. I worked 2 jobs to pay for community college. When he brought home mediocre grades, my mother celebrated. When I brought home straight A's, she barely acknowledged them. I recounted specific incident dates when I could remember them, witnesses who'd been present. The Christmas when he got a new bike and I got socks. The birthday when she forgot mine entirely, but threw him a party with 30 guests. After your father died, how did your mother's treatment change? Catherine asked. This was harder. My throat tightened, but I pushed through. She told me it was my fault. She said if I'd been more like my brother, maybe the stress of having a daughter like me wouldn't have killed him. I was 15 years old, and I believed her. I saw several jurors' expressions shift, saw sympathy replacing skepticism. I became her emotional punching bag. Every time she was angry or sad or frustrated, I was the target. My brother was protected from her grief. I absorbed it. Patricia Brennan's cross-examination was designed to rattle me. She stood close, her voice sharp. Isn't it true, Ms. Lopez, that you resented your brother's success? I looked directly at her. No, I said calmly. I resented being invisible. There's a difference. The courtroom stirred and I saw Brennan's jaw tighten. Isn't it true you fabricated this lawsuit to profit from a viral video? She pressed. No, I said. I filed this lawsuit to stop my mother from continuing to destroy me the way she's destroyed everyone else who's ever challenged her. This isn't about money, it's about accountability. Brennan tried several more angles, suggesting I was mentally unstable, vindictive attention-seeking. But 6 months of therapy and 10 months of fighting had forged something in me that couldn't be shaken by courtroom theatrics. I answered every question calmly, factually, without anger or defensiveness. When she finally dismissed me, I saw frustration in her eyes. I'd been a better witness than she'd expected. But the real fireworks came when Catherine recalled Mrs. Peterson for cross-examination. Mrs. Peterson, Catherine began, her voice pleasant, you testified yesterday that the Lopez family moved away when Amanda was 16. Is that correct? Mrs. Peterson nodded confidently. Yes, that's right. Catherine pulled out a document. This is the property record for the house next to yours. It shows the Lopez family sold the property in March of 1998. Amanda was born in 1989. That would make her 9 years old, not 16. Can you explain the discrepancy? Mrs. Peterson's confidence faltered. Well, I might have been mistaken about the exact year. Catherine nodded. Let's talk about Amanda's bedroom. You described it as being on the second floor, painted pink, with butterfly decals, with a desk by the window that you could see from your bathroom. Is that correct? Mrs. Peterson nodded. Yes, I remember it clearly. Catherine turned to the jury and held up several photographs. These are photos of the Lopez house interior from 1998, provided by the current owners who found them in the attic. Amanda's bedroom was on the first floor at the back of the house. It was painted beige. There were no butterfly decals, no desk. In fact, Mrs. Peterson, the room you described matches the description of a different house entirely, doesn't it? Mrs. Peterson's face went pale. It was a long time ago. Maybe I'm confused. Catherine's voice sharpened. Or maybe you're not confused at all. Maybe you're describing a completely different family because you barely knew the Lopez family. How many times would you say you were actually inside their home, Miss Peterson? The elderly woman stammered. Several times. Catherine produced another document. Bank records show that 2 weeks before this trial, you deposited $5,000 into your checking account. A check written from Linda Lopez's account. Can you explain why the defendant paid you $5,000 right before you testified on her behalf? The courtroom erupted. The judge gavelled for order. Mrs. Peterson's mouth opened and closed, no words coming out. She said it was she needed help with... Catherine's voice cut through. She paid you to lie. She paid you to testify that Amanda was a troubled child when you barely knew the family. She paid you to provide false testimony that would discredit her daughter. No further questions, Your Honour. The judge's face was severe as she addressed Mrs. Peterson. Ma'am, I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for potential perjury charges. You may step down. Mrs. Peterson left the stand looking 20 years older, and I saw several jurors looking at my mother with open disgust. Catherine had been right to let her talk. My mother had been so confident in her ability to manipulate to buy testimony, to construct false narratives that she hadn't considered the possibility of being caught. After the lunch recess, Catherine asked me to take the stand again this time, to describe the wedding incident itself. I'd told this story so many times to police, to attorneys, to journalists, that part of me wondered if I'd become numb to it. But as I began to speak, describing the moment my mother's hand grabbed my hair, the pain that shot through my scalp, the humiliation of falling to the floor in front of 150 people, I felt it all again as fresh as if it had just happened. I looked up at her. I said, my voice breaking slightly, and I saw something in her face that I'd seen my whole life but never had a name for. Satisfaction. She wanted to hurt me. She'd planned it. And when I left, she immediately played the victim, told everyone I had issues, made herself sympathetic, while I bled on the inside. I wiped my eyes. I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to sue my mother. I wanted a mother, but I needed to be safe. And she would never let me be safe as long as she could control the narrative. And when I spoke again, describing the wedding incident, even the bailiff wiped tears from his eyes. The deliberation took less than 4 hours. When the bailiff announced the jury had reached a verdict, my heart hammered so hard I thought everyone in the courtroom could hear it. Catherine squeezed my hand as we stood. The jury foreman, a middle-aged man in glasses, who'd taken careful notes throughout the trial, handed the verdict form to the judge. She read it silently, her expression unreadable, then looked directly at me. In the matter of Lopez versus Lopez, she began, her voice clear and authoritative. On count 1, assault and battery, the court finds in favour of the plaintiff. On count 2, defamation, the court finds in favour of the plaintiff. On count 3, intentional infliction of emotional distress, the court finds in favour of the plaintiff. On count 4, interference with business relations, the court finds in favour of the plaintiff. On count 5, fraud, the court finds in favour of the plaintiff. 5 for 5. Complete victory. The judge continued, and her words felt like they were coming from very far away. The court finds that Linda Lopez's behaviour toward her daughter was calculated malicious and part of a long-term pattern of psychological abuse spanning decades. The evidence presented, including video documentation showing premeditation, witness testimony, establishing historical pattern, and the defendant's own fraudulent actions during these proceedings, demonstrates a clear and willful intent to harm the plaintiff both physically and emotionally. She announced damages $75,000 for medical bills I'd incurred for therapy, lost business contracts, and emotional distress. Then came the injunction. The defendant is hereby prohibited from contacting the plaintiff directly or indirectly, from contacting the plaintiff's employers or clients, and from making any public statements about the plaintiff's mental health or character. Additionally, as a condition of this injunction, the defendant must post factual corrections on all platforms where false psychiatric claims were made, specifically correcting the false statement that the plaintiff was treated for delusional disorder in 2015. I watched my mother's face as the verdict was read. The careful mask she'd maintained throughout the trial crumbled. Her shoulders shook, tears streamed down her face, and for once they looked real. But they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of rage and humiliation at being held accountable, at losing control of the narrative she'd spent my entire life constructing. Her attorney put a hand on her arm, but my mother shook it off, standing abruptly. "This is wrong," she said, her voice breaking. "She's my daughter. I gave her life." The judge's expression hardened. "Mrs. Lopez, you will sit down. The verdict has been rendered. You have the right to appeal, but in this courtroom, this matter is concluded." My mother sat, but not before shooting me a look of such pure hatred that I felt it like a physical blow. The judge continued with instructions about the payment timeline and the specifics of the injunction, but I barely heard her. It was over. After 10 months of fighting after a lifetime of abuse, it was officially, legally over. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed shouting questions. "Amanda, how do you feel about the verdict?" Do you have a statement for your mother? Will you pursue criminal charges? Catherine fielded most of them with practiced efficiency, but they wanted to hear from me. I stopped on the courthouse steps, Marcus on one side and Sarah on the other, and I gave them the only statement I had in me. This was never about revenge, I said, my voice steady despite the exhaustion weighing on every word. It was about stopping a cycle. It was about saying that abuse doesn't become acceptable just because it happens within a family. It was about accountability. I hope my mother finds peace, but I also hope that anyone else living in silence, afraid to speak up about family abuse, sees this and knows that your truth matters, your pain matters, and you have the right to protect yourself, even from the people who are supposed to love you. I declined all interview requests after that, ignoring the business cards pressed into my hands and the promises of book deals and speaking opportunities. All I wanted was to go home, take a long bath and sleep for about a week. Catherine drove me back to my apartment, and we sat in her car for a moment in silence. "You did it," she said finally. "You survived." I nodded, too tired for words. "Get some rest," she said. "We'll talk next week about enforcement of the judgment and the injunction." I made it as far as my couch before collapsing still in the conservative grey suit I'd worn to court. I thought I'd feel triumphant, vindicated, victorious. Instead, I just felt hollow. Winning a lawsuit didn't erase 35 years of trauma. It didn't give me back the childhood I should have had, or the mother I'd always wanted. It just drew a legal line in the sand and said, this far no further. It was important. It was necessary. But it wasn't healing. That would take longer, and it would be harder than any courtroom battle. My phone rang around 7 that evening, Catherine's number on the screen. "I thought you said that we talk next week," I answered, trying to inject some lightness into my voice. "We will," she said, but her tone was strange, carefully neutral in a way that made my pulse quicken. "But something else has come up. I received a call this afternoon from an attorney named Robert Chen. He's been trying to locate you for approximately 10 years. "Why?" I asked, sitting up. "He's the executor of your father's estate. Apparently, there are documents you were supposed to receive, conditions that had to be met before they could be released to you. Amanda, he has a letter from your father, and according to Mr. Chen, it explains everything." My hand trembled as I held the phone because whatever my father left behind had been waiting for this exact moment. I met Robert Chen the next morning in his office, a modest space in a building near the waterfront. He was perhaps 70, with kind eyes and a gentle demeanour that immediately put me at ease, despite my churning anxiety. "Ms. Lopez, yo," he said, shaking my hand. "I've been trying to find you for a very long time. Please sit down." He pulled out a thick file, the papers inside yellowed with age. "Your father came to me 3 months before he died. He knew his heart wasn't strong, he'd had 2 previous incidents, and he wanted to ensure certain things were in order." Robert opened the file and showed me documents I'd never seen, never known existed. My father's will, executed 20 years ago, laid out in precise legal language, 50% of his estate to my mother, 50% to me. The estate had been valued at the time of his death at approximately $140,000. With careful investment over 2 decades, my share would be worth close to $280,000 today. "Your mother was named as executor," Robert explained. "She was legally required to disclose this to you when you turned 18, or when you inquired about the estate, whichever came first. According to my records, she never disclosed it. She managed the entire estate as if you didn't exist in the will. The betrayal was so massive I couldn't quite process it." Is there any way to claim it now?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Robert's expression was regretful. "The statute of limitations for challenging estate distributions in Oregon is 3 years from the date you discovered, or reasonably should have discovered the violation. Since your father died 20 years ago, and you're only learning of this now, we'd have to prove your mother actively concealed it, which, while likely true, would be difficult to prove definitively after this much time. I'm sorry, Amanda. The money is probably beyond recovery. So my mother hadn't just stolen my childhood, my peace, my sense of self. She'd also stolen $250,000 that my father had left specifically to protect me. Robert must have seen something in my face because he reached across the desk and touched my hand gently. But that's not why I asked you to come. Your father left something else. A letter sealed with very specific instructions. It was to be given to you under one of 3 conditions: when you turned 35, when you initiated legal action against your mother, or when I learned of a significant family conflict. Your lawsuit triggered the release condition. He handed me an envelope, thick and cream-coloured, my name written in my father's handwriting across the front. My hand shook as I opened it pulling out several pages of notebook paper covered in his familiar script. My dearest Amanda. It began, and I had to stop, press my hand to my mouth, and breathe through the wave of grief that hit me. My father had been dead for 20 years, but reading his words made the loss feel fresh and immediate. If you're reading this, it means conflict has finally surfaced between you and your mother. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry. I hoped it wouldn't come to this, but I feared it would. There are things you need to know. Things I should have told you when I was alive, but I was a coward. I was drowning in my own grief, and I let you drown too. He explained about Emily, my twin sister, in more detail than my mother ever had. How they'd been at a birthday party at a neighbour's house. How Emily and I had wandered to the pool area while the adults were distracted. How we'd both fallen in, neither of us able to swim. Your mother jumped in immediately. "Goes," he wrote. "She tried to reach both of you, but you'd drifted apart in the water. She had to choose. In that split second, she grabbed you, pulled you out, and dove back for Emily. But it was too late. Emily was gone. Your mother performed CPR until the ambulance came, but our daughter was already gone." I could barely see the words through my tears now. The guilt destroyed her, Amanda. Every time she looked at you, she saw Emily's face. You were identical twins. You were a living reminder of the daughter she couldn't save. She never forgave herself for choosing you. And she never forgave you for surviving. He wrote about trying to get her help, about therapists she refused to see, about his own failure to protect me from her grief-fueled rage. I should have left her. I should have taken you away. But I was grieving too, and I was weak, and I told myself you were young enough that you wouldn't remember that things would get better. They didn't. They got worse. By the time I realised how bad it had gotten, I was sick, and I knew I didn't have much time left. The letter explained the money. I leave you this inheritance not as compensation. Nothing could compensate for what we failed to give you, but as a foundation. Build a life where you never need to beg for love from people incapable of giving it. You deserved better than we gave you, Amanda. You deserved parents who could see you for who you are, not as a reminder of who we lost. Your mother loved you in her broken way, but her love was destroyed by grief, and I failed to protect you from the wreckage. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I love you. I'm proud of you. I believe in you. Be happy, sweetheart. Be free, Dad. I collapsed forward, my head on Robert Chen's desk, and sobbed. For my father, who'd known and hadn't been strong enough to save me. For Emily, who'd drowned before I could even remember her. For my mother, trapped in grief, so profound it had poisoned everything she touched. And for myself, the little girl who'd spent 35 years wondering what was wrong with her, never knowing she'd been paying for a tragedy that happened before her memory even began. I collapsed to my knees, understanding flooding through me, but could I forgive the woman who destroyed my childhood because of a tragedy neither of them chose? The answer to that question didn't come easily or quickly. I spent the next week barely functioning, moving through my days like a ghost. I'd wake up in the middle of the night with my father's words echoing in my head. She had to choose, and I'd imagine my mother in that pool reaching for 2 daughters and only being able to save one. Some nights I cried for her for the impossible choice she'd faced, for the guilt that had eaten her alive for 35 years. Other nights I'd lie awake furious because understanding her pain didn't erase mine. She'd had a choice every single day after that about how to treat me, and she'd chosen cruelty. I called Catherine and told her about the embezzled inheritance. Her response was immediate and professional. "We can pursue this. Criminal charges for theft, or at minimum a civil suit to recover the funds with interest. The statute of limitations might be flexible given active concealment." But I stopped her. "No," I said, and my voice was steady. "She's lost her job, her reputation, a lawsuit judgment she can't afford to pay. She's lost enough. And I don't want her money, Catherine. I never wanted her money. I wanted my peace. And pursuing this would just tie me to her for another year of legal battles. I'm done." Catherine was quiet for a moment. "Are you sure that's a substantial amount of money?" I was sure. The money my father had left me was meant to be a foundation, but I'd built my own foundation without it. My business was successful, my condo was paid off. I'd survived and thrived without the inheritance, and claiming it now felt like it would contaminate everything I'd built on my own. "I'm sure," I said. "Let it go." My therapy session that week was one of the hardest I'd ever had. I told Dr. Martinez everything, the letter Emily, my father's confession of his own failure, my mother's impossible choice. "I don't know how to feel," I said, my voice breaking. "Part of me wants to forgive her now that I understand, but another part of me is so angry because understanding doesn't erase what she did to me for 35 years. Dr. Martinez leaned forward, her expression gentle but firm. "Amanda, understanding why someone hurt you doesn't mean you have to maintain a relationship with them. Those are separate things. You can hold both truths simultaneously. Your mother suffered greatly, and she chose to make you suffer for it. Both are real. Both matter." She continued, "Your mother experienced unimaginable trauma. That's true. But she had options. She could have gotten therapy. Your father tried to get her help, and she refused. She could have seen you as the daughter she saved instead of the daughter she lost. She could have directed her grief at the tragedy instead of at you. Every day she made choices about how to treat you, and those choices were hers. Trauma explains behavior, but it doesn't excuse it." Those words settled something in me. I could acknowledge my mother's pain without taking responsibility for healing it. I could understand her grief without accepting her abuse. I started a new practice that week, something Dr. Martinez suggested. I found a large glass jar and a stack of small papers, and every evening I wrote down one thing I was proud of myself for that day. The first entry was simple. Today I chose myself. I folded the paper and dropped it into the jar. The next day I didn't call her back when she left another voicemail. The third day I told the truth, even when it was hard. Small things, ordinary things, but they were mine. They were evidence that I was building a life that wasn't defined by my mother's abuse or my fight against it. Some days were harder than others. I'd hear a song on the radio that reminded me of my father, and I'd have to pull over and cry. I'd see a mother and daughter shopping together laughing, and I'd feel a grief so profound it took my breath away. But I'd also have days where I'd finish a design project and feel genuine pride, where I'd go for a run and feel strong, where I'd meet Sarah for coffee and laugh until my sides hurt. I wrote in my journal one night, trying to make sense of the contradictions I was living. Some days I'm strong, some days I cry over a song. Both versions of me are valid. Healing isn't linear, and that's okay. The healing jar filled slowly. I set a boundary with a client who was being demanding. I cooked myself a nice meal instead of eating takeout. I called an old friend I'd lost touch with. I went a whole day without thinking about the lawsuit. Each piece of paper was a small rebellion against the voice in my head that still sometimes whispered, I wasn't enough, wasn't worthy, wasn't deserving of peace. That voice was my mother's voice, and I was learning to replace it with my own. 2 weeks after reading my father's letter, I realised I needed to close this chapter completely, not with revenge, not with reconciliation, but with finality. I needed to say what I needed to say, not to get a response, not to change my mother's mind, but simply to release the words I'd been carrying for 35 years. I needed to speak my truth one final time, and then I needed to let it go. Then I picked up my pen one final time and began writing the letter that would close this chapter forever. The letter took me 3 days to write. I'd start, then stop, then crumple the paper and begin again. I wanted to get it exactly right, not for her, but for me. This wasn't about changing her mind or getting her to understand. This was about saying what I needed to say so I could finally let it go. On the 4th morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and wrote it straight through my hand, steady my mind clear. "Mum," I began, and even writing that word felt strange, now distant. "I know about Emily now. Dad's letter told me everything about the pool, about the choice you had to make, about the guilt that's haunted you for 35 years. I'm sorry for your loss. Truly, deeply sorry. I can't imagine the pain of losing a child, of having to choose between 2 daughters in a moment of crisis. That trauma wasn't your fault, and I grieve for the sister I never got to know, and for the mother you might have been if tragedy hadn't broken you." I paused, sipped my tea and continued. "But I'm also sorry that I paid the price for a tragedy I didn't cause. I understand your pain now. I understand that every time you looked at me, you saw Emily's face, saw the daughter you couldn't save. I understand that your grief was so enormous it consumed everything, including your ability to love the daughter who survived. But understanding doesn't erase what happened to me. For 35 years, I was punished for surviving. For 35 years, I tried to earn love from someone who couldn't give it because she was drowning in guilt and rage. I understand your pain, but I can't carry it anymore. It was never mine to carry." The words flowed easier now, like a dam breaking. "I don't hate you. I want you to know that. I've spent a lot of time in therapy trying to understand my feelings, and hate isn't what I feel. What I feel is grief. Grief for the childhood I should have had. Grief for the mother-daughter relationship that was destroyed before it could even begin. Grief for all of us, you and me and Dad and Emily, all of us casualties of one terrible moment that none of us chose. But I can't have you in my life, Mum. I've tried. For 35 years I tried to be good enough, quiet enough, invisible enough that maybe you'd finally see me with love instead of pain. It never worked. It was never going to work." I wrote about the lawsuit, about her retaliation, about the fake medical records and the manipulated audio and all the ways she tried to destroy me when I finally stood up for myself. Your apologies came only when you faced consequences, not when you saw my pain. Every time you said sorry, it was followed immediately by blame, by excuses, by demands that I forgive and forget and let you continue to hurt me. That's not apology. That's manipulation. And I'm done accepting it. Then came the hardest part, the part that had taken me weeks to understand. I forgive you, Mum. Not because you deserve it or because you've earned it, but because I need to. I forgive you for my own peace, for my own ability to move forward without this rage eating me alive. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. Forgiveness doesn't mean I have to let you back into my life. Forgiveness means I'm releasing the expectation that you'll ever be the mother I needed, and I'm releasing myself from the belief that I'm unworthy of love because you couldn't give it to me. I could feel tears on my cheeks now, but they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of release. I hope you find healing, Mum. I really do. I hope you get therapy. I hope you learn to forgive yourself for Emily's death, because it wasn't your fault. You were a mother trying to save both your daughters, and you saved the one you could reach. That wasn't a choice. That was tragedy. But what happened after the way you treated me for 35 years? Those were choices. You could have gotten help. You could have seen me as the daughter you saved instead of the daughter you lost. You could have directed your grief at the tragedy instead of at me. You made choices, and those choices were your fault. I wrote about the future, about the life I was building without her. I'm creating a life where I'm no longer invisible, where I don't shrink myself to make other people comfortable, where I choose people who can love me fully, not conditionally, where I believe I'm worthy simply because I exist, not because I've earned it through suffering. You won't be part of that life, Mum. The court has prohibited you from contacting me, and even if that injunction expires someday, I'm asking you to respect my boundary. Don't call, don't write, don't try to reach me through other people. I need space to heal, and that healing requires distance from you. I ended with words I never thought I'd be able to write. I release you from my expectations. You don't have to be the mother I needed. You don't have to acknowledge what you did or apologize or change. You can spend the rest of your life believing you were right and I was wrong, if that's what you need to survive. And I release myself from needing your approval, your love, or your recognition. I'm enough without it. I always was. I'm building a life where I'm no longer waiting for you to see me. I see myself now. That's enough. I signed it simply, Amanda, not daughter, not with love, just my name. I folded it carefully, placed it in an envelope, and walked to the post office that afternoon. As I dropped it in the mailbox, I felt something lift from my shoulders, a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. I walked home slowly, breathing in the autumn air, noticing the changing leaves, the smell of coffee from a cafe, the sound of children laughing in a park. Small things, beautiful things, things I'd been too burdened to notice before. I'm building a life where I'm no longer invisible. You won't be part of it, but I wish you peace. Goodbye, Mum. 2 years passed. I learnt to breathe again. Then one call from the hospital changed everything one last time. Those 2 years had been the quietest, most peaceful years of my life. I'd expanded my design business, taking on a junior designer and moving into a larger office space. I'd travelled to Barcelona and spent 2 weeks just wandering through Gaudi's architecture, letting beauty fill the spaces where pain used to live. I dated someone briefly, a kind architect named James, who made me laugh and never once made me feel small. It didn't work out, but it ended gently, and I walked away knowing I was capable of healthy love. I'd started teaching a monthly workshop on interior designs for domestic violence survivors, helping women reimagine their spaces as sanctuaries. My healing jar had filled completely, and I'd started a second one. I thought about my mother maybe once a month, usually triggered by a random memory, but the thoughts no longer sent me spiralling. I'd built a life and she wasn't in it. Then my phone rang at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, an unknown number that I almost didn't answer. "Is this Amanda Lopez?" a tired voice asked. "This is Providence Hospital. You're listed as the emergency contact for Linda Lopez. She's been admitted with a cardiac event. It's serious. Can you come?" My first instinct was to say no to explain that there must be a mistake, that I wasn't her emergency contact anymore, couldn't be. But I heard myself saying, "I'll be there in 20 minutes, and hanging up before I could change my mind. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot for an hour, engine off, staring at the building. I didn't owe her this. I'd said goodbye 2 years ago. I'd meant it. But some part of me knew that if I drove away without seeing her, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering. Not wondering if she'd changed, not hoping for a deathbed reconciliation, but wondering if I'd made the choice that let me live with myself. Finally, I walked inside and took the elevator to the cardiac unit, my heart pounding harder than it had even during the trial. She looked so small in the hospital bed, diminished in a way that shocked me. At 60 years old, she looked 80. Her hair was completely grey, thin and lifeless. Her face was gaunt, her skin papery. Monitors beeped softly around her, and an oxygen tube ran under her nose. When she saw me, her eyes widened, and something that looked like relief washed over her features. "Amanda," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You came." I stood at the foot of the bed, keeping distance between us. "The hospital called. They said you listed me as your emergency contact." She nodded weakly. "I never changed it. I hoped, someday." She trailed off, and I saw tears beginning to slide down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice broke. "For all of it. I'm so sorry, Amanda. These past 2 years alone, I've had time to think. Time to see what I did. I punished you for surviving when Emily didn't. I made you pay for a choice I had to make. It was never your fault. None of it was ever your fault." I felt my own tears coming and didn't try to stop them. This was what I'd wanted to hear my entire childhood. This acknowledgement, this admission, this apology that didn't come with a but attached to it. "I see now," she continued, struggling to breathe. "I was so broken by losing Emily that I destroyed everything else. I destroyed you. I destroyed any chance we had of being a real family. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She reached out her hand, trembling, and after a long moment, I took it. Her skin was cold and fragile, and I could feel her pulse fluttering weakly beneath my fingers. We sat like that in silence, 2 women connected by blood and trauma, and 3 decades of pain. "Can you forgive me?" she finally asked, her voice desperate. "Can we start over? I don't have much time left, Amanda. Can we have something, anything, before I go?" I took a deep breath, gathering all the strength I'd built over the past 2 years. "I forgive you, Mum," I said, and I meant it. "I forgave you a long time ago for my own peace, but I can't start over. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. Forgiveness doesn't mean we can build something now that you refused to build for 35 years. Her face crumpled, but I continued needing her to understand. "You're apologizing now because you're dying, because you're facing the end, and you don't want to go with this guilt. But I needed you when I was 15 and believed I'd killed my father. I needed you when I was 10 and couldn't understand why you looked at me with hate. I needed you when I was 5 and just wanted my mother's love. You weren't there then. You chose not to be there." I stood gently, placing her hand back on the bed. "I hope you recover. I really do. I hope you have years left to find peace, to get therapy, to heal from Emily's death. But I won't be coming back, Mum. This is goodbye. Not with anger, but with boundaries. I'm building a life where I'm whole, and that life requires distance from you." I expected anger denial, another manipulation, but instead she nodded slowly, understanding, finally settling into her expression. "You're right," she whispered. "You're absolutely right. I'm sorry it took me until now to see you clearly." Then she said something that broke me. "I'm proud of you, my daughter. You're strong in ways I never was. You broke the cycle I couldn't break. I'm proud of you." It was the first time in 37 years she'd ever said those words. The first time she'd called me my daughter with something that sounded like love. I cried then, standing beside her hospital bed, crying for the mother-daughter relationship we'd never had for Emily, who never got to grow up for my father, who tried and failed to protect me for all of us, broken by one terrible moment 35 years ago. I left without looking back, walking through the hospital corridors, with tears streaming down my face, past nurses and visitors, and other families dealing with their own crises. I drove home in the pre-dawn darkness, and when I got to my apartment, I sat on my couch and let myself grieve. Not for my mother, but for the fantasy I'd finally completely let go of. The fantasy that someday she'd change, that we'd have a real relationship, that love would somehow emerge from the wreckage. And when I closed my eyes that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in 35 years, truly, completely free. That freedom became the foundation for everything that came next. I woke up the morning after the hospital visit feeling lighter than I had in years, not because my mother had apologised, but because I'd finally closed that door completely. I no longer needed her to change, to understand, or to validate my worth. I was whole on my own, and from that wholeness I could finally build something that mattered not just to me, but to others who were still fighting battles I'd already won. I started with my design business, but I shifted my focus intentionally. I began specialising in creating what I called trauma-informed spaces, redesigning homes for women who'd escaped abusive relationships or toxic family situations. These weren't just aesthetic renovations. They were intentional transformations that helped people reclaim their environments as places of safety rather than stress. I worked with therapists to understand what made spaces feel nurturing, how colour and light and layout could either trigger old wounds or promote healing. One client told me after I'd finished redesigning her apartment that it felt like permission to breathe. That phrase became my unofficial tagline. But the design work, as fulfilling as it was, felt like only part of what I was meant to do. I kept thinking about my father's letter, about how he'd wanted to give me a foundation to build a life where I never had to beg for love. He'd tried to do it with money that my mother had stolen, but I'd built that foundation anyway on my own. And now I wanted to give that same foundation to others. I wanted to create something that would have helped the 15-year-old version of me, the girl who believed her father's death was her fault, who had no one to tell her that the abuse wasn't her fault either. It took 8 months of planning fundraising and navigating non-profit regulations, but Emily's Light opened its doors on a Saturday morning in early spring. I'd found a small building in southeast Portland, nothing fancy but warm and welcoming with big windows and comfortable furniture that didn't look institutional. The centre offered free counselling for women and adult children, escaping emotional abuse, legal consultations with volunteer attorneys, job training workshops and support groups. We had a small library of books about trauma and healing, a quiet room for meditation, and a community space for workshops and events. At the grand opening with Marcus and Sarah and Dr. Martinez, all there to support me, I gave a short speech that I'd practiced 100 times but still made me cry. This centre is named after my sister Emily, who I never got to meet. She died when we were 3 years old, and her death broke my family in ways that shaped my entire life. But breaking cycles is an act of love. It's the hardest, most important work we can do. This centre exists to help people break the cycles that have been breaking them, to say you're not alone, your pain matters, and you deserve a life where you're not constantly fighting just to breathe. The response was overwhelming. Within the first month, we were serving 20 women regularly, and the waiting list kept growing. I hired 2 part-time counsellors and a programme coordinator. I taught monthly workshops on setting boundaries and recognising manipulation tactics. I watched women walk in looking defeated, and over weeks and months watched them slowly come back to life. It was the most meaningful work I'd ever done, and every time I unlocked the door to Emily's Light, I felt like I was honouring not just my sister, but every version of myself that had survived to make it possible. Then 6 months after we'd opened, I received an unexpected email. The subject line read, "From Jessica, can we talk?" Jessica was my brother's wife, the woman who'd posted manipulated audio recordings during the lawsuit, who'd supported my mother's lies, who'd been part of the family system that had rejected me completely. I stared at the email for a full day before opening it. "Amanda," it began, "I know I have no right to reach out after what I did, but I'm in therapy now dealing with my own family issues, and I'm starting to see how I enabled your mother's abuse of you, how I participated in it. I'm so ashamed. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wondered if you'd be willing to meet for coffee. I'd like to apologise in person. I understand if you say no." I debated for a week, asking Dr. Martinez what she thought. Only you can decide if you're ready for that, she said. But remember, you get to set the terms. You don't owe her anything. Finally, I agreed to meet, but at a coffee shop near Emily's Light, on my territory with a time limit. Jessica showed up looking nervous, older than I remembered, with dark circles under her eyes that suggested her own struggles. "Thank you for coming," she said as we sat down. "I wasn't sure you would." We talked for an hour and it was awkward and uncomfortable and honest in ways I hadn't expected. She told me about her own marriage to my brother, how it had been crumbling for years, how she'd finally started therapy and realised how much of her life she'd spent trying to keep peace by enabling toxic behaviour. "I threw you under the bus to protect myself," she said, tears in her eyes. "I knew your mother was lying, but it was easier to go along with her than to stand up for what was right. I'm so sorry, Amanda. You deserved better from all of us." I listened, not ready to fully forgive, but willing to hear her out. Then she said something that surprised me. "My daughter is 5 now. Her name is Sophia. And I'm terrified I'm going to mess her up the way our family's messed us up." She looked at me directly. "I want her to know what healthy boundaries look like. I want her to know a woman who stands up for herself even when it costs her everything. I've been thinking about this for months, and I wanted to ask if you'd consider being Sophia's guardian if anything happened to me and your brother. I know it's a huge ask, but I want my daughter to know you." I was speechless. This woman who'd tried to destroy me in court was now asking me to be the person who'd raise her daughter if she died. It was absurd and touching and complicated in ways I couldn't fully process in that moment. "I need to think about it," I said finally. "That's a big responsibility." She nodded. "Of course, take all the time you need. But Amanda, for what it's worth, you're the strongest person I know. And I'm sorry it took me this long to see it." 6 months later, a little girl's laughter filled my home for the first time like a promise of peace. Sophia had become a regular presence in my life over those 6 months, visiting every other Saturday for what she called Aunt Amanda days. We'd bake cookies, work on art projects, visit the park, and sometimes she'd just sit in my design studio and draw while I worked on client proposals. Her laughter, so pure and unburdened, filled spaces in my heart I hadn't known were still empty. She reminded me why the work mattered, why breaking cycles was worth all the pain it took to get there. And watching her grow up knowing she was loved, knowing she had multiple adults who'd protect her, knowing she'd never have to earn affection through silence and smallness, that was its own kind of healing. It was Sophia, actually, who inadvertently led to the interview. She'd asked me one Saturday why I had a framed article on my office wall, the one Sarah had written 3 years ago about family violence going viral. "That's about my mum," I'd explained gently. "A long time ago, something hard happened and I had to stand up for myself. It was scary, but it was important." She'd looked at the article with serious 5-year-old eyes and said, "You're very brave, Aunt Amanda." That simple statement from a child made me realise how much my perspective had shifted. I wasn't a victim anymore. I wasn't even just a survivor. I was someone who'd walked through fire and come out the other side with something to offer people, still burning. When Rachel Morrison from the Reclaimed Lives podcast reached out requesting an interview, I declined 3 times over the past 2 years. I wasn't ready to be a public figure to have my trauma packaged as content. But this time, thinking about Sophia's words and the women who came through Emily's Light every week, I said yes. The interview was scheduled for a quiet afternoon in the podcast studio, intimate and conversational, rather than interrogative. Rachel was in her 50s, warm and thoughtful, someone who'd done her research and genuinely cared about the subject matter. We talked for over an hour, covering everything from the wedding incident to the trial to the work I was doing now. Rachel asked insightful questions that let me tell my story with nuance without reducing it to simple victim and villain narratives. Then near the end, she asked the question that made me pause and really think. "Amanda, your mother passed away 8 months ago. I know you weren't in contact with her at the end. If you could say one thing to her now, what would it be?" I took a breath, feeling the weight of that question. My mother had died of another heart attack alone in her apartment. I'd learned about it from the obituary which my brother had published without contacting me. I'd grieved in my own way privately, not for the mother I'd had, but for the mother I'd never gotten to have. I'd say, I began slowly choosing my words carefully. I understand you were drowning. I understand that losing Emily destroyed you in ways I'll never fully comprehend. But I was drowning too, and you held my head underwater for 35 years. I wish you'd learn to swim instead of pulling me down with you. Rachel was silent, letting the words settle. I continued feeling emotions rise, but keeping my voice steady. I love the idea of who you could have been, the mother who could have directed her grief at the tragedy instead of at me, the mother who could have gotten help, who could have seen me as the daughter she saved instead of the daughter she lost. I love that version of you, the one I created in my mind as a child, the one I kept hoping would appear. But that version never existed, and I've had to learn to love myself more than I love the fantasy of who you might have been. The interview shifted then to advice for listeners experiencing similar situations, and this was the part I'd been most nervous about. I didn't want to present myself as someone who had all the answers, but I also knew my story could help people see possibilities they hadn't imagined. If you're listening to this, and you're living in a toxic family system, here's what I want you to know, I said, looking directly at Rachel, but speaking to everyone who'd eventually hear this. You don't owe anyone your pain. Not your parents, not your siblings, not anyone. The idea that family deserves unconditional loyalty, regardless of how they treat you, is a lie designed to protect abusers. I leaned forward, passionate now. Silence protects the abuser, not you. I stayed silent for 35 years, and all it did was let my mother continue hurting me without consequence. The moment I spoke up, people told me I was vindictive, ungrateful, destroying the family, but the family was already destroyed. I just stopped pretending it wasn't. Rachel nodded, encouraging me to continue. And here's the most important thing. Your worth isn't determined by who loves you. It's determined by how you love yourself. I spent decades thinking something was wrong with me because my mother couldn't love me. But her inability to love me was never about my worth. It was about her wounds. And once I understood that, once I really internalized it, everything changed. The interview went live a week later, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours, it had been downloaded 50,000 times. Within a week, over 300,000. The podcast, social media filled with comments from people sharing their own stories of family estrangement, of finally setting boundaries, of learning to prioritize their own well-being over family obligation. My email inbox flooded with messages, hundreds of them, each one a story of pain and courage. You gave me courage to finally report my father. One woman wrote, I'm 62 years old, and I spent my whole life thinking I had to forgive him because he was family. Your story showed me I don't. Another message, I left my toxic family because of your story. I packed my car and drove across the country. I'm terrified, but I'm free. Thank you. A man in his 40s. I'm in therapy now because of your interview. I've started talking about what my mother did to me. It's the hardest thing I've ever done, but I'm doing it. I read every single message, sometimes crying, sometimes smiling, always grateful that my pain had somehow transmuted into something that could light the way for others. Emily's light saw a surge in applications from women who'd heard the interview and finally felt ready to get help. 3 different domestic violence organisations asked me to speak at their conferences. A publisher reached out about a book deal. I declined most of it, but I did start speaking quarterly at events, always careful to maintain my own boundaries, always remembering that helping others couldn't come at the cost of my own healing. And for the first time in my life, I understood I was no longer just existing. I was showing others how to live. Showing others how to live had become my purpose, but living my own life with joy and intention remained my practice. On a quiet Saturday morning in early autumn, I drove to the cemetery, where my father had been buried 23 years ago, and where I'd placed a marker for Emily 2 years earlier next to his. The air was crisp leaves just beginning to turn, and the cemetery was nearly empty. I found my father's grave first simple and understated the way he'd been in life. I placed white roses on it, knelt down and traced his name with my fingers. "Hi, Dad," I said quietly. "I read your letter a few years ago. I wish you'd been stronger. But I understand grief now. I forgive you, and I want you to know I built that foundation you wanted for me. Not with the money Mum stole, but with my own hands. I think you'd be proud." I walked to Emily's marker, a small granite stone that read Emily Rose Lopez born and died together with her sister forever, 3 years old, forever loved. As I approached with my second bouquet, I stopped short. There were already flowers there, fresh pink roses, and tucked beneath them was a note in my brother's handwriting. My hand shook as I read, "Dear Emily, I'm sorry I never knew you. I'm sorry I didn't protect our sister when she needed protection. I was so busy being the golden child that I never questioned why Amanda was treated differently. I should have seen it. I failed you both. I'm trying to be better now." "Your brother Michael?" I sank to the ground and cried. Not from sadness, but from recognition that healing was spreading, that the cycle I'd broken was allowing others to break their own. My brother was facing his complicity, now taking responsibility. It didn't erase the past, but it was growth. It was hope. I pulled out the letter I'd written and read it aloud. "Dear Emily, my sister I never got to meet. I've lived the life you didn't get to live, and I didn't waste it. I've loved, fiercely failed, boldly, and survived what tried to break me. I lived for both of us, Emily. Every moment of joy, every success, every time I chose myself, I did it for both of us. Rest peacefully, little sister." I tucked the letter beside my brother's note, placed my roses next to his, and stood. A small sparrow landed on Emily's headstone, looked directly at me, then took off toward the sun. I watched it disappear into light, and I could have sworn I heard something in the wind, not, "I'm sorry, but something that felt like, "I'm proud of you." My phone buzzed. A text from Jessica with a photo of Sophia at the park, mid-laugh, pure joy captured in pixels. The caption read, "She asked about Aunt Amanda today, wants to visit soon, as you promised to teach her to paint." I smiled and typed back, "I'd love that. I have so much to teach her about being brave." I drove home slowly, wanting to see the city I'd built my life in, the coffee shop where Marcus and I still met, the building where Catherine practiced law, Emily's light, probably full of women working on their healing, the park where Sophia and I would paint next weekend. This was my city, my life, my family, the one I'd chosen and built and fought for. Some families are born, some are chosen, and the most important family you'll ever have is the one you build when you finally choose yourself first. I'd been born into a family broken by tragedy and twisted by grief, but I'd chosen to build something different, a family of people who showed up for each other, who told the truth, who loved without conditions, Marcus and Sarah and Dr. Martinez and Catherine. The women at Emily's Light who understood survival. Jessica and Sophia, proof that even damaged family trees could grow new, healthier branches. And myself. Most importantly, myself. For 35 years, I'd been homeless in my own life, wandering through spaces that belonged to other people's narratives. But I'd finally found my way home, and home wasn't a place or a person. Home was the moment I looked in the mirror and recognized the woman staring back. Home was knowing I was enough exactly as I was, with all my scars and strength and stubborn refusal to stay broken. Home was choosing myself every single day, even when that choice was hard. For the first time in 35 years, I was home. Amanda's story didn't end with her finding peace. It continued every day in the lives of the women who walked through the doors of Emily's Light, in the messages from strangers, who found courage in her words, and in the laughter of a little girl named Sophia, who would grow up knowing that love doesn't require you to make yourself small. Her journey from invisible daughter to empowered woman wasn't just about survival. It was about breaking a cycle that had destroyed generations, about choosing truth over peace, and about learning that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from people who can't love you the way you deserve. This story reminds us that family isn't always the people we're born to. Sometimes it's the people we choose, the ones who see us clearly and love us anyway. Amanda learned what so many of us need to hear: your worth isn't determined by who loves you, but by how you love yourself. Forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. Understanding someone's pain doesn't mean accepting their abuse. You can hold both compassion for someone's trauma and boundaries against their toxicity. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've been the scapegoat or the forgotten child, I want you to know that your pain is valid. Your truth matters. And, like Amanda, you have the right to choose yourself, even when everyone else tells you that's selfish. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to set boundaries with family members? What did Amanda's journey teach you about forgiveness and healing? Your stories matter, and sharing them helps others who are still fighting feel less alone. If you found value in Amanda's story, please subscribe to this channel. We share stories of resilience, survival, and the courage it takes to break free from toxic patterns. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that might be exactly what you need to hear. Remember, speaking your truth isn't vindictive, setting boundaries isn't cruel, choosing yourself isn't selfish. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to drown while someone else is pulling you under. Thank you for listening to Amanda's story. And if you're currently fighting your own battle for peace and freedom, please know this: you're not alone, you're not wrong, and you deserve better. Keep going. Your breakthrough is coming.